He's 10 years older than me, and so he was a product of the 80s, really,
right?
Because he was a teenager in the 80s, whereas
I was barely just born halfway through that decade.
I mean, I was born bang on 80. So I was born at the beginning of 80. So that's. But so we clubbed
babies, you little.
Oh, good evening.
Hello, Jack. I'm surrounded by tiny little toddlers.
Yeah, the children of Thatcherism, effectively. Born into it, knowing no difference.
Well, we were just talking about video games and computers, and I was saying that it's something that makes me feel like a techno immigrant rather than a techno native, because I'm just on that generation that weren't lost in this. We got it gradually. We saw a lot of it on Tomorrow's World.
Yes,
Judith Hann explained it to us, but it was still remote.
And also on Tomorrow's World, getting it terribly wrong, of course.
Oh, totally.
I do remember, because we got the Commodore Amiga, which was our first computer when I was 5. And so I do vaguely remember a time before there were computerized things in the household, but not very clearly. And that was like the Commodore Amiga was like the first in the UK. It was the antecedent to home computing. It was a proper computer. It did word processing, and it had
the first time I had a sort of cache at school. Because they were like people I'd never interacted with. I think you got a Commodore Amiga. So, and I remember feeling a sort of a sort of stab of I shouldn't have it. I remember it sort of rather as I have tonight. This guilt is carried down the decade. I had to explain to people. Yeah, but we clubbed together with my cousin's family. We're time sharing it.
right. Just to keep that working class cred, right?
Totally. Interestingly, my parents did with my cousins. With my cousin's parents, so my aunt and uncle, they did that with their first car. They time shared their car between them. They basically they bought a car as two separate families, and my parents had it like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they had it Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday.
It makes enormous sense, does it not?
Yeah, and then we lived in shoebox in the middle of the road.
It's got to be like that, hasn't it? I was eating
luxury.
Old apple in the back of that car, to be honest. We couldn't afford a cooker.
Well, in that you are a step up from me, because my parents don't drive. They've never driven. They've always got around by public transport. So they've never driven. It's a really strange situation now,
I'm the living
everybody
proof
drives
that
now,
you can pass, because I took 5 times to pass.
Right. Well, actually, maybe it's because of
my
my parents' influence, but I'm learning now.
Right.
I've always just gotten around by walking or by public transport. It's never even been a thing, But I'm learning now.
The absolute incredible nerves and anxiety. It's a really strange thing for someone who's been an actor to admit. But when hundreds of people are watching you in an auditorium, it kind of gets diffused. But when one person is scrutinizing what you're doing, and even to the extent where, I mean, my poor long-suffering partner, if she comes near me when I'm reading or working, I say, I'm really, really sorry, Vicky. Is it okay if you just step away? I'm not being rude, but it just feels like the scrutiny is bad. And my left
city effect.
Yeah, my left leg. I mean, I'm not talking shaking. It was practically coming off. And of course, the clutch is there. So maneuvers, I used to fail on maneuvers, and then as I got to it was the 5th one, and things sort of worked out on that one for some reason, just long enough to pass.
I love it.
It's the city effect. Having lived in the middle of the city and lived in a village, you feel much more private in the city. Walking down the middle of Oxford Street or something.
Yeah.
I feel much more private, much more alone than I do walking through the village that I live in now.
Yeah.
Because people don't look at you in the city.
No.
And that's one of those classic whinges about the city, isn't it? Oh, it's impersonal. I'm like, yeah, that's what's so great about it.
Yeah. You can be anonymous.
I passed my driving test on my second attempt, and I'll tell you what happened. The first time I took the test, I completely went to pieces, just instantly.
Right.
Just
I just did that 4 times.
Gibbering wreck, right? And it was obvious. It was obvious that I'd failed within 2 minutes, right? So, but we had to carry on all the way through. As I was that makes it worse. So I actually went to my doctor. Somebody said to me, "Get some beta blockers." I went to my doctor and I said, "There's these. Somebody's told me get beta blockers." He said, "Oh yeah, I'll give you some of those for a driving test." Yeah, sure, no problem. So I take beta blockers before I take my test the second time. Just ace it. Just no problem at all. Well, I had this thing on the second test where the instructor said, "Right, go, X, Y, Z," and I went into the wrong lane on the roundabout. And roundabouts were absolutely my bugbear while I was driving. I was just completely fucked them up all the time. On the driving test, full of beta blockers, I'm like, oh, I'm on the wrong lane. Never mind. I'll just go around again and get off on the right. It was fine. And I that was how I realized that I was an anxiety sufferer. If you'd asked me before that, I would have said, "Yeah, I'm a bit of a worrier." But my doctor said, "No, you've got anxiety."
Yeah.
Interesting.
I had a very interesting one
every day now, and it's fucking great.
So it required that experience for you to understand that it was abnormal, right?
Yeah. I had a bit of an episode on beta blockers because I had an eye condition called Pigment Dispersion syndrome, which to cut a very long story short and to put it very, very crudely, there's sort of various tubes behind the eye, of course, and the pigmentation in our eyes recycles. And what mine was very crudely doing was the pigment, the color was kind of going in, the pigments were going in, but the tubes to drain it away on its recycle period were too tight, so it was packing in, and it was blinding me.
Oh wow!
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow!
I went to this was 2000. Because a friend of mine just said, I'm sure when your eyes were green, and my eyes are green. And he said, they look brown. I said, oh well, you don't think much of it,
right? Yeah.
And there was one day I woke up and the person next to me said, I think we need to go to the eye infirmary. Your eyes are black.
Oh my God!
Couldn't see anything, and so
either that or we need that Anglican exorcist.
I was going to say mother, isn't it? Yeah.
It was
the eye. Yeah.
So I had a kind of laser treatment, which was, again, very crudely speaking, they blasted a couple of holes in the tubes to allow the sediments to drain out, and but they wanted a sort of belt and braces thing, so they said, we're going to put you on this drug. I didn't know it had quite a powerful beta blocker in it. And years later, when I was at drama school, I completed drama school, and I was out on a tour, and every 2 years I had to go and get this checked, and I was in the Sidcup eye infirmary, so I was near Sidcup on this tour, and they were fascinated by this because they said, oh wow, very few people actually have this.
I was going to say it must be a very rare condition. One.
So the two things that absolutely sort of went through me that day was the casual way in which the consultant went, yeah, you see, I've just had to do one of these, and unfortunately we've had to tell the young woman that it's not been successful, and oh gosh, he said, but then you're in that lucky 12%, and I went, whoa, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, wow.
12% of people who respond well to this procedure. No one told me that.
Oh,
great. I said, and when you say that they've passed this procedure, there's no chance of it. No. Once it's done, and I've just checked it, and it's still, it's everything's as it should be. He said, I'm just slightly worried. Given that the job you do and how physical it is and everything, that you're on a beta blocker. And I said, right. And he said, but all your general it's coming out as if you're not. And he said, but I'm a little bit worried. I just don't think it's a good combination. And it was because I used to smoke. I haven't smoked for 10 years. So the smoking was sort of counteracting the beta blocker. And consequently, it was stopping me from passing out every night doing this show, because it was you shouldn't be able to do what you're doing in this show on this beta blocker. It's a little bit harsh, You're a smoker. And I was like, yeah. He said, well, you shouldn't be doing that anyway, particularly as well. You're doing. He said, but actually, I think the effects of the smoking are sort of raising your blood pressure. I can't get them back down. He said, so. Yeah, I should recommend this, but keep doing that for the moment, and then we'll take you off this beta blocker. And can you stop smoking as well? It was like, okay.
Brilliant.
I just take caffeine tablets when I need energy.
Yeah.
I'm literally down to coffee being my only vice now, which is hey ho.
But have you ever experienced I'm a non-smoker, but on very rare occasions I have been known to have a cigarette, just on the off socially or whatever. When you're a non-smoker, the neurological effect of having just one cigarette is unbelievable. It just it wires you. It feels like quicksilver running through your mind. It is absolutely.
Well, it's the counterintuitive thing that people say they have a cigarette to calm their nerves. Sometimes, of course, it's everything that's going through you is doing absolutely the opposite. It's stimulating you. Yeah.
As a
I mean, it's
you get the stimulus more than anything. It's becomes very sharp and very quick and very clean.
Because I haven't smoked for exactly 10 years, 11 years. I haven't smoked for 11 years, and but to the extent now where even the smell of smoke, I can't deal with it. I can't actually believe I ever did.
Yeah. It does. It stinks. It does. It's foul. It does smell really bad.
Yeah, and but the whole thing, I know 10, 11 years is quite a long time, but it really does feel like another life. It's like,
right.
I spent most of my 20s smoking, and it's like, what?
Well, my dad has smoked his whole life since he was 15, and he stopped 2 weeks ago. He stopped 2 weeks ago, and he's done really well. He said, I visited him today, and he actually said, you know what, I don't even want one. He said it's the weirdest thing. He made the decision, and some circuit has gone in his brain, and it's just like, I don't want it anymore. And that's it. That's the end of it.
It's hard to crack. I mean, it really. I mean, all the stories are true. It is hard to. And I didn't for some reason I can't even begin to describe. I didn't go for the patches or the gum or anything. I just went, well, I'll just stop.
If you're gonna do it, yeah.
But it was tricky. There were a couple of false dawns, but they weren't sustained for too long. It would be like I'd have 2 or 3 and then be so pissed off with myself that it would mean I went longer in between each interval.
Right. So the sort of the self-recrimination helps.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It was really, really good that I had all those childhood repressions and everything, all that anxiety and guilt. It actually turned into something really useful.
If you want to stop smoking, kids,
just have deep-seated psychological damage.
Absolutely.
It's fine. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's no problem for UK children, is it? That's absolutely no problem whatsoever. That's isn't it? So
just part of it,
right?
Yeah. Comes with the deal, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. It certainly does.
And to just leap back and the game we had, the big game that really, really sort of because I've never been. Video games is something that's rather passed me by, but the big game was Batman.
On the Amiga?
On the Amiga, because it came out around the time of the original Tim Burton Batman game, and that game felt like wow when I was 10 years older. Right?
That was a big title on the Amiga as well. It was a big seller. That was. It was one of didn't they have one of those they did themed packages, didn't they, with the Amiga?
That's right.
And Batman was one of them, wasn't it?
Yeah. The marketing for that film was. I think it's probably the first film I can remember in terms of just how much it was marketed. And I think it was my very first awareness of really how mainstream Hollywood movies are. It's an absolute assault, isn't it?
Well, it was a blitzkrieg, wasn't it? It was an absolute blitzkrieg. There was, of course, the 1990s Batman cartoon that came off the back of it, which is superb, by the way. It's an amazing cartoon.
I love that.
Great.
Yeah. Detective noir for kids. I mean,
I honestly think Harley Quinn in that is one of my favorite fictional characters, flat of all time. She's amazing.
The Harley and the Ivy episode is the best one.
It's amazing,
just glorious.
If somebody sort of inexplicably said to me, here's $100 million, make a superhero movie, it would absolutely be about Harley and Ivy.
Well, Batman exists in a sort of similar. Well,
it wouldn't
like
be the
most
Margot
things that
Robbie
we've
Harley either. With all due respect to her,
Yeah.
it would be my version of Harley from the cartoon, because
from the 1990s cartoon. Yeah,
but I think one of the things I've sort of grown up being aware of is that most of the pop culture that's been sort of pushed my way, like all of it, is always being sort of curiously in the negative. It's like Batman should be a support character in that series, in the same way that Blade Runner shouldn't be about Deckard, or very often Doctor Who shouldn't be about the Doctor, or any of these. It always we're presented with all these sort of big pop culture things as being in the wrong mode, almost, being in the wrong key.
It's almost like there's something that's kind of constantly acting as a drag factor, constantly forcing culture to focus on white men.
Really, the rubbish bit, the wrong thing.
Yeah,
which I'm sure will allow us to segue beautifully
into the principal subject on the discussion. Yeah,
and I'm going to apologise in advance, because Jack put a message up on Twitter which almost frightened me. So, I've got notes, I've got ideas. It's like, shit. I've just got a random set of crap in my head.
I must admit, I am so glad now, in retrospect, that we didn't do it last time when we were scheduled to do it, because I'd made the profound mistake of watching it that afternoon. And it was filling my head. That bloody film, it does it every single time I watch it. I don't know why I didn't understand that it was going to do it this time, because it does it every time. It does it every single time. It filled my head like a wasp's nest, and I was just frantic with it. I don't think I could have given any kind of coherent discussion on it, to be honest.
It is one of those total experiences, isn't it?
Yeah. I had a slight fear, and I said this to George when we had a little chat last week. I had a slight apprehension before I watched it, because it's been an awfully long time. And I sometimes worry about these things that I know I value in some way. I think, oh, crumbs, is it as good as... And then, of course, within 35 minutes, oh, my God, actually, I think it might be better.
Yeah. Well, again, I was hypnotized by it. I was totally hypnotized by it. I had other things that I sort of should have been doing at the time, but I couldn't. I sat and watched the entire damn film from beginning to end, unbroken, unmoving. And by the end, I was doing that thing that I often do when I'm excited by a bit of media. I did this outside the cinema when I went to see The Joker, Jack, walking up and down in my living room, talking to myself about it.
Yeah, I grok about it.
I think I've told you this before, but I had it's not always a positive thing for me. Sometimes I walk out of movies so angry with them, or it's not even, sometimes it's just value neutral. They will create such a flow of thoughts in my head. And when I came out of the second of the Apes movies, the recent trilogy, I can't remember. The first one is Dawn and the second one is Rise, I think. Something like that. Anyway, it was the middle one. And I came out of it and I ran to the car, because I just had to find any piece of any surface I could write on to get the thoughts down.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? I mean, I often have that thing as well where I come out, certainly when I go to the cinema, I'll often come out of a film and not know how I feel about it, just knowing that I'm feeling something profound. And it takes a while for it to digest. That's actually what happened to me when I first watched Don't Look Now.
Same. Yeah,
it was a profound experience, and I knew it's one of those strange things where I knew of its reputation before I saw it. We didn't have it was there ever a VHS release of it in the UK?
I'm not aware of one. I definitely saw this on television.
Right.
Again, we probably watched the same BBC screen.
Yeah, very
right. Yeah. I didn't even see it on television.
I do remember my father saying, "Oh, this is great." He hadn't seen it since it had been in the cinema, and he made. I seem to recall him making a point that we all watched it.
Oh!
And I was welcome to watch it. Yeah,
Don't look now. It's not family viewing.
But I've explained about my parents before, haven't I? I mean, certainly my father's complete lack of understanding about what is suitable for children to this day. So as far as he was concerned, this was just something I had to watch.
Okay.
And I might have been 12, or something.
Yeah. I can imagine certain scenes for a 12-year-old maybe perhaps eclipsing all others, you know.
But I always remember that, as you would expect, that that had more of an effect on me than it did on them. I remember the first time I saw something on the television which had a sex scene in. Again, something I shouldn't have been watching because I must have been about 7, and that was The Singing Detective. The Singing Detective has a sex scene in its first episode. And even at the age of 7, because children aren't quite the romantic, innocent things that society, I kind of knew certain things. Certain things had reached me through the grapevine of the playground. And the profound, sweaty palmed embarrassment. Because I also didn't want them to know that
you knew or that you had. Absolutely, yeah. But my God, I mean, the sex scene in this film, of course, it feels almost like reductive to call it that in many respects, doesn't it? Because it's so significant to the rest of the story. It's so significant to these characters, but it is one of the best I've ever seen. It's so beautifully cut together. I love that conceit of having it cut together with them dressing in the morning after. I love that so much. It lends it a certain softness, doesn't it? Which I just adore.
I think it's profoundly about being married, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
This is where I've never been married, so we run into difficulties with me commenting. But I think that's what it's about. It's about a married relationship. I mean, lots of people have pointed out that most sex in cinema is about sort of people who are fucking for the first time. They've just met and they're in the first flush of romance, etc., etc. And this is obviously a different kind of sex. This is sex between in an established relationship. And I think it's very strongly implied that this is the first time they've made love since their daughter died.
It's a reconciliation, isn't it? It's a moment of reconciliation
or a resumption.
After this awful tragedy, and also before everything breaks down in incredible style.
I think that really feeds into the form of it as well, because whilst I was watching, I watched it with my partner, and I said, I'm pretty sure this must be the first time, because there's been a sort of breakthrough, and but it's very much there in the there's a slight. I mean, it's a very tenderly portrayed, but there's also a slightly fumbling, almost coy first time about it, and then it slips into actually very relaxed and very and you were saying just then, George, about the parallelism with the dressing, but I think the actual sex scene itself shows up something that I think is a through line of the entire movie, which is it is a movie. Not wholly, I don't want to be reductive about it, but it is a movie about alternative takes.
Yes.
Whereas in a film, the alternative takes here all exist on the same plane. Now, no one else would do that. They'd make a film of successive takes.
Right.
But I think the sex scene very, very subtly moves between a kind of coyness and a tenderness and a relaxed thing, which maybe could be the arc the actual sex runs through, but because of his editing technique. But we also have this situation where we have these odd assemblages of takes. So for example, as we briefly chatted about last week, there's one take during the film where John Baxter is unable to speak Italian, but in another take he can. There's one where he falls to his death and one where he survives. That one's slightly more pointed out. But even subtler things like Laura Baxter has straight hair when she's in England. Her hair is curly when it is in Italy.
Right.
And I think the sex scene runs on a similar thing. It feels like an assemblage of different takes, as if all those various different kinds of sex occurred in the same plane.
It's almost like a Mandela effect thing happening, isn't it? It's what's happened here. It's the story and the events that happen within the story are married to the form and the medium. So this medium, which can be edited and shot from various different ways, becomes synonymous with reality itself. It's almost like there are multiple different realities that are occurring simultaneously from which the film is assembled. It's so bizarre and wonderful.
It is a film that is intensely concerned with itself in terms of its own medium, and as media, it announces itself several times in that sense. I mean,
images. The notion of images comes up again and again and again. And Nicholas Roeg himself has actually said this was his exercise in film grammar, I believe, was the language that he used.
Yeah, exactly, and a lot of it has the feel of somebody playing with form for the sake of it. The fact that it manages to do that in a way where nothing ever feels impertinent or self-indulgent is quite an achievement, isn't it?
Right.
Yes, and I think the fact that his subject matter was something so intensely emotive, so intensely passionate in its way, it stops the film just feeling like an exercise.
Right. It stops it feeling just like an assemblage of technicalities, right? It becomes a human story as well. It's about human beings being banded around in this existential nightmare, effectively.
It reminds me very powerfully of another of my just all-time favorite movies, which is Orson Welles' F for Fake.
Right.
It's quite similar. I mean, it's intensely different in almost every respect, and yet at the same time, it does remind me powerfully of that, because that is also a film that is extremely about the process of film, and on a deeper level about the process of representing meaning, and about how that is just kind of an inherent, simultaneously an inherently forlorn thing to do, and an absolute essential of human life, that we do that,
And it seems to be something that this film absolutely acknowledges. I mean, you made the point on Twitter, Jack, that so many people who talk about this film tend to just use terms like symbolism and so on and so forth, but they use them in vague or generalized terms. They don't talk about what could be being symbolized here, or what the meaning is, or anything to that effect. And it's a mistake one way or the other, isn't it? If you try to solve this film and try to say what is happening, then you've probably made an error. You've probably made a mistake.
Yeah, no, I agree. Loads of the people that I've read writing about this do this thing where they go through loads of stuff about the film. What Laura's hand gesture mirrors Christine's hand gesture, etc. The film is absolutely bursting with stuff like that. Aesthetic,
like
mirroring, and echoes, etc., etc. And they will sometimes very acutely and sensitively, I've read an essay by David Thompson. David Thompson's a decent critic on a good day. They will go through this stuff, but what you get at the end is just kind of this. It's all very meaningful. Nicholas Roeg does this and Nicholas Roeg does that, etc., and it's all terribly meaningful. And then you get to the last paragraph, and they don't say what it means.
Say why. I find that really strange.
Meaningful all by itself.
To be honest, given my last viewing, I find that rather strange, because I think it is a film about meanings, I suppose, or significance rather, like a kind of resonance. But at the same time, it's also a film about meaninglessness. The final act of the film, which is one of the most horrific scenes in all of cinema, it's so powerful and emotive, is so profoundly pointless. Like John Baxter's death is so profoundly pointless, despite the fact that it's presaged and it's part of this strange metaphysical pattern that's happening throughout the film. He is effectively condemned from the first frame. He is heading towards this moment always and forever, and yet it's meaningless, isn't it? There's no poetry to that death. There's no purpose to it. It's almost like the film is saying, it's almost like the film is saying, you know what, you are a piece of grit in the machine. You maybe even be part of a puzzle piece, but that puzzle doesn't mean anything. It's like a paint by numbers or a jigsaw puzzle. There's no actual wider poetry to it. You're just slotting where you're meant to be slotted, and that's the end.
As he dies, you get that amazing montage, which I'm not honestly sure how I feel about it, to be honest. Oftentimes, I mean, I love this film, but oftentimes when you get that closing montage as he dies, where it shows you clips of loads of the movie that's just gone by, as it's happening, I kind of often feel a bit annoyed by it, to be honest, it's like the film is kind of searching for something in itself for this to mean, or it's saying, search as you will, and there is nothing in what has happened.
I think there's something to be said about the way Rogue reacted to the end of the story, du Maurier's story, because he spoke a great deal about, how he was interested in although he is a director who was one to say that everything is interconnected, coincidence does not exist. Mm-hmm. One of the things is the break between two different art forms, because he said that when he read the final line of Don't Look Now, which is a thought of John Baxter's, and it's simply, what a bloody silly way to die as he's dying. Rogue said, I stood up and cheered. Mm-hmm. I was reading alone, but I stood up and put the book down and cheered, and I knew that I wanted to turn it into a film, and I knew I'd never be able to capture that moment because that is totally prose. Right. So I was left with, I've got a fascinating disconnect between this world of prose, this world of narrative, and the way the world of narrative kind of works through image-based cinema. And he said, I'm never going to be able to capture that thought. What am I going to do? And I think there might be something in that montage at the end. It's almost, I don't know where to go. I'm just flicking pages.
It may be that. I mean, it does work though. The effect of it is to remove it from the significance of the text. Like the text effectively ends on a punchline, doesn't it? It feels almost like a joke, right? It's got a slightly satirical, comedic quality about it, the text, but the film does not. If it is a joke, it's a really gallows one, and it's played on humanity. It's whatever the force is that's guiding us all through this engine, whatever the name of the engine is, whether it's God or fate or whatever. It doesn't give a rat's ass, right?
The great deal of the film seems to be a pushback at our idea of measuring or organizing or structuring anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's in the content as well as the form. And again, it's something that we can talk about in terms of gender as well. I mean, because all the characters in it who are attempting that are failures.
This film is intensely about gender relationships for me.
And also this awful, this central irony in a way that this perception, this gift, this ability, whatever it is, in that relationship is given to the wrong person.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an awful tragedy.
Right. If Christine was the one who had that particular gift, she would have run with it, right? In the context of this film, she would have run with it. She would have acknowledged it. John doesn't, and it ultimately leads him to his prescribed fate.
Yeah, there is a. I mean, I was going to say a reading of this film, and that actually casts it in more doubt than I want to, because it's not just a reading. I think this is because one of the secrets about that, I was talking about all these critics that sort of say, "Oh, it means a lot," and then when you it just means all by itself. It means something.
A lot of meaning.
What does it mean?
It's meaning without specificity,
like truthiness.
Yeah. Right.
As I was saying on Twitter, there's that Terry Pratchett joke about this thing is symbolic. What's it symbolic of? It's not symbolic of anything in particular. It's just symbolic. Yeah.
Right.
And I think a lot of people talk about this film, and that there's other works of art that critics do this with, like Kafka, etc.
Yes,
But I think the kind of dirty secret about this film is that the stuff that's in it that means something specific is actually pretty simple. Mm-hmm. And it tells you when something means something, it tells you that pretty clearly. Like even some of the hallucinatory imagery or the supernatural imagery, when John sees the image of Laura and the two sisters, or supposedly sisters, on the barge in black on the canals after Laura has supposedly left for England, I think it's pretty clear what that is.
Precognition, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I think
it's him seeing the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, they're all dressed in black, and come on, everybody knows what that's doing. Mm-hmm. It's not. The film is not actually being cryptic about that. And there's various things like he keeps seeing this image of somebody small wearing a red coat. Well, that's not obscure. I mean, obviously, he never says, is that Christine? And I don't think he ever thinks that it is Christine. No. But nonetheless, there is something about it that draws his attention, and we know why. And that's not obscure. Anyway, I'm getting drawn off course. What I'm saying, The film is full of visual echoes and stuff like that, because it's just about that's just life, it's about the process of feeling, and it's about the process of artistic representation and so on. So when it does these echoes of things, it's just saying, yeah, things echo.
Absolutely,
and they create the impression.
Sorry, go on, Jack.
They create the impression of meaning in our minds, and that is. And
that's it, isn't it?
We construct our meanings from those echoes and assonances and dissonances and resonances that are just all around us, because we live in material space and social space and historical space, etc. That's just life. Now, the thing about the film is that where was I going with this? I've completely lost my thread. Never mind. Go on.
No.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of one of the things that struck me, and again, it's because the interconnectedness of things, and we've talked about this before on a number of these, of how the act of watching something, you are overlaying it with every other scrap of information and experience that you've had, and every other thing you've read, and every other thing you've experienced. And one of the things that I kept coming back to with this, and I thought, well, du Maurier's would have been a contemporary, and there's something about this that plays into the idea of film and how film works, and particularly someone like Rogue, who likes to show us process, was J.W. Dunn's experiment with time, which was a huge influence on J.B. Priestley. Now, I first came into contact with this because I was in a stage version of Time in the Conways, and when I was doing my research, I was saying about Priestley, was fascinated by this very in vogue thing. It was one of those things that was in vogue for about 5 years and then sort of went off into obscurity, which was this guy Dunn, who had been a First World War soldier. He came up with this experiment in time, this thesis, this essay, and all about precognitive dreams. And the idea that and it plays very much into Baxter and Don't Look Now, that you foresee future personal experiences, and how the moment we're in, the now, if you like, is part of this sort of infinite sequence of higher dimensions that are all stacked one against the other. And as Jack was just saying, our consciousness filters these things out to allow us to experience a sort of semblance of order, to not go completely mad.
So like a sort of delusion of continuum that doesn't exist.
And this sort of feeds into our disposition towards measuring out time. And so dreams and unconscious moments allow us a glimpse of a fuller picture, as this film keeps coming back to. And all this comes into time in the Conways, in the second and third acts of the play, which are the kind of fault line of two potentials. But what really fascinated with me when of course you factor in that Nicholas Roeg has directed this film, is that there's stuff in Dunn's work that points towards, I'm using air quotes here and you can't see me because it's a phrase I do not deploy lightly, aboriginal dream time, which inevitably taps into Nicholas Roeg's film Walkabout, then Nicholas Roeg's film Don't Look Now, and Nicholas Roeg's film The Man Who Fell to Earth. And then a little later on again, the Nicholas Roeg film Insignificance, a brilliant film, often overlooked. There is a real, but I think in terms of the trilogy, Walkabout, Don't Look Now, and The Man Who Fell to Earth, it's all very, very strongly felt. This idea about time, narrative, memory perhaps being imagination in reverse, precognition, what is the now, how does time work, what is the construction of clock time, does it waylay us in terms of our understanding of a much subtler time, the geometry of time and places. And I tried to find if there was any sort of anything about Du Maurier having come across this vis-a-vis Priestley, and I couldn't find anything. So it's all up for grabs. But it just, that's where my brain went. I thought the whole way this is constructed is very, very, taps very into that J.W. Dunn experiment with time essay or thesis from whatever it was, the 1920s.
I think it is. It's definitely a preoccupation of Du Maurier's, but I think it's more of a preoccupation of Roeg's, to be honest. It's stronger in the film than it is in the short story. That's for damn sure.
I've remembered where I was going before I got drawn off course, which was that the reading of the film, which is that it's about John, obviously the male, the husband, as the embodiment of a rational view of life, and Laura as the female, the wife, as the emotional view of life. Now I think there's something, I mean, that, as I was saying, that's a reading of the film, and it's not just a reading of the film, it is in the film. I mean, that is textual. She believes in the spirit world, etc., and he is aggressive in his denial of it. That comes directly from Du Maurier's original story. Du Maurier's original story is, I think, fundamentally about that. I think if it is about one thing, it is about that, and it is very definitely about that on gender lines, because Du Maurier is obsessed with gender. Du Maurier is fascinating on gender because of her own fascinatingly strange, mixed up gender and sexual identity. I don't know how much you know about this, but this was a woman who, I'm going to be very careful what I say here, but I think maybe today we would think of her as in some way genderqueer or somewhere on that spectrum, because this was a woman who consciously conceptualized her writing self as male. And her personal private self as female. This was a woman who had crushes on other women, reciprocated and unreciprocated, who had affairs with other women, and who professed to despise lesbians. This is a woman who, possibly was, it's not known for sure, but she might have been sexually abused by her father, who is known to have wanted a boy and treated her like a boy, and treated her like she was a boy and he was her brother. So she comes from this very weird place. She married a man whose nickname was Boy, and he went around having affairs, I believe, with people of both genders. And this is coming from a really strange. Strange. I don't mean that.
What's interesting,
it's a conflict, isn't it?
Both in her life and in her writing, and even in this story, is because I know, for example, she herself went to Venice because she was distraught at the death of Gertrude Lawrence, whom she adored. And
Du Maurier is one of these people who had like a private vocabulary. And Venice was like her word for gay. Venetian was her word for lesbian relationships and things like this, which she professed to despise. She talked about her love for other women, and she would say, but if anybody referred to that relationship or those feelings by that disgusting L word, I would kill them and things like this. This is a woman who, in many respects, is in her attitudes is extremely misogynistic, and I think you find that in the original story. You find in the original. I mean, I'm going to be honest. She's not a writer that I rate, to be honest. And you find in there are good things in the story, but I wasn't impressed by it when I reread it.
It is not as interesting as the film, isn't it? It is in no way does it approach the complexity or the majesty. It doesn't have that fraught existential nightmare quality that the film has.
She certainly does. One thing that struck me is coming from a great deal of what Jack's just talked about, but also, again, in that wonderful way that Nick Rogue clearly appreciates the disconnect between one kind of art and another, and how how an adaptation is obviously going to slip away in certain respects, is the curious thing of how she strongly intimates in the story that the sisters actually might be, again using air quotes, men in drag.
Yes,
also in the sense that again, if I'm going to come back to this notion I have about the assemblage of alternative takes, it almost seems like Rogue hints at that in the sequence when they're laughing.
It's that amazing. That one insertion.
We've pulled the fast one. We've pulled the wool over your eyes. But I don't think it, again, because I keep coming back to the idea that this is an assemblage of alternative takes. I don't think it's a definitive thing. It's not. It's not a window onto anything. I don't think it's anything to do with their motivation or intention. It's something poking in from another time. Another part of the assemblage.
There's no context. There is brilliantly no context for why they are laughing. And in any of the scenes that frame them, the ones that come before, the one that comes after, their tone and their timbre and the way they're framed is completely different.
They
and that's
seem
why I think
completely
the scene,
sincere, don't they?
yes,
in every other part of the film.
Every other part, and this is why I think the scene of John falling and John not falling is our key to that. Also in the scene where, for some reason he can no longer speak Italian, and then he can. I think we are getting a multi-take experience, and I don't think it's just for some arbitrary formal reason. I think there's something very much in there about this idea of choice and the unreliability of what we think the present and the past and the future might be. Everything's up for grabs. It's all warping. But there was just one little tidbit of just a little behind the scenes info that I was just reminded of there when you were talking, which was, again, it feeds into this so beautifully, because Rogue really wanted Sutherland and Christie. He even waited to get them. And there's this fantastic moment where they both turn up. I think one of the very first sequences to be shot is the quite lengthy sequence when they're in the church and she lights the candles, and he's reacting. He goes off and looks at the orb, the light, and starts to play with it. But Rogue, of course, very famous for not storyboarding, not being over keen on rehearsal, because he had this thing about liking chance and unexpected things and spontaneity. First, second takes. Most of his films are first and second takes. But the line when John says, "I don't like churches," and Laura shoots back at him, "Well, I do," was absolutely added at the last minute, because that's Sutherland and Christie's first sentences to each other arriving on set, and Rogue heard them.
Oh, interesting.
It's going in because you've just, either because you've been immersing yourselves in this and you've been reading the script, been learning your lines and everything, or that's them. That's them there. Just there, absolutely captured in those two lines. So they ended up writing part of the scene quite inadvertently. Donald Sutherland said, "I don't like churches," and Harry Mead goes, "Well, I do." And it's slightly confrontational, isn't it?
And that together with absolutely, there is a friction there. But again, the film is intensely about gender relationships, intensely about marriages, and how they are full of conflict that is submerged a huge amount of time. But it's also like the fact that she's lighting candles and he's playing with an electrical lighting rig. There's the visual contrast reinforcing the dialogue, but between her basically the same an approach to the same thing, lighting, but hers is ancient and religious and etc.,
right?
And his is modern and technological and so on,
and rational.
And that does reflect something that is not only a reality in Du Maurier's original story, where it is very much about the rational, modern-minded scientific man and the emotional, irrational woman, because Du Maurier identifies with him. I mean, the story is told from his point of view, and the authorial voice inhabits his mind, etc.
It does, yes.
And then that happens in a lot of her writing, even when the male figure is not the protagonist. You can kind of tell that Du Maurier identifies with Maxim de Winter than the unnamed narrator, etc., etc. But it is his reality in the film as well. I mean, the film does tell to a certain extent, hackneyed story, about the wife is more open to the emotional and the spiritual, etc., and the husband is more rational and aggressively so. In fact, there's the painful scene where she's trying to communicate to him how much she needs to believe this thing, and the film isn't on her side as such, but it is plain that she just emotionally needs this at this point. And he, I suppose, equally justifiably, but in a horrible moment, very aggressively, he's shouting at her, she's dead, and you get where he's coming from with that, and in that situation you might feel the same way, but it's a horrible moment because it's aggressive, cruel, and and it's cruelty that comes from distress and pain, etc. So it's a very empathic moment, but it is nonetheless cruel. But that's absolutely right the way through the film. And I think this film is intensely I think this film is fundamentally about how men think women see them. That is how I see this film as being about. And I think it's it's a very complex vision because. You were talking before about the way that this film is as alternate takes, and I love that because it's great. It's like it frames the film as like, Schrodinger's film. We're seeing
exactly right.
We're seeing the inside of the box before we're somehow seeing it without collapsing the waveform, and we're seeing the cat in both quantum states simultaneously.
It's that weird sort of Mandela effect thing going on where you are seeing like multiple incarnations of reality, just subtly, like microscopically removed from one another, but somehow existing in the same space and time.
Yeah, and that ties in beautifully with it as an occult film, a film about the supernatural, with Todorov's distinction between the uncanny and the I can never remember the names of the categories, but he distinguishes between different modalities of the uncanny, where one is it is collapsed down into an artifact of consciousness, and the other version is where consciousness is the apparition or the phenomenon or whatever is definitely occurring outside of consciousness.
Yeah, so
and then I would say there's a third
both.
mode where it refuses to resolve itself one way or the other, which in many ways is the most interesting. And
that's what this film encapsulates, isn't it?
Yeah.
Totally.
I think there's something in the film itself and the way the film drives.
To all experience, doesn't it? It goes beyond just whether or not the apparition exists in or out of consciousness. This film is basically getting at the fact that the apparition in that respect is kind of a metaphor for everything. This film is about human consciousness as apophenia, that is basically what human consciousness is. It is the creation of patterns from this insane mess of contradictory data that's constantly coming at you.
Well, you see that in every element of the film, don't you? Even the environment, even Venice itself, right?
Yeah.
There's that one of the, there are obvious reasons for setting it in Venice, but one of them is Venice is a labyrinth, right?
Yeah.
And it all looks
and it's liminal
right. It's confusing. It's a city out of time. It's
like the crenellations of a brain. It's like
the
maze and The Shining.
In The Shining, exactly.
Yes.
Perception. Yes. But what I think kept coming back to me in the film is, now this might be fanciful, it might be something I'm projecting onto it, but it seemed to me that the film itself has such a passion that even when it does that thing that you just said, George, you said it earlier about the absurdity that the film falls down on and the sort of tragedy really, but because of the way that if I'm sticking to this idea of an assemblage of different takes, it's almost like the film wants him to find the right take. It keeps showing the potential of the correct take where he is helped onto the scaffold by the Italian work. He doesn't fall to his death. The take where he makes a connection with someone and starts to say, it's like John Baxter himself resists what the film wants him to do.
Yeah, right. He's almost like
something, because the film's not clinical. If it were made by a different director, maybe a director with a more austere eye, if it were made now, it'd be made by bloody Christopher Nolan. But that would show
we've spoken about him before.
Yeah, that would show the disparity. There is something incredibly passionate about Rogue. It's in all his films. I mean, they always end up being tragedies, but it's like The Man Who Fell to Earth. The enormous sympathy and how it wills Thomas Newton to succeed when the last scene will be him drunk and unable to get home to see his family, or Insignificance, the passion it has for Einstein and Marilyn Monroe, and when Einstein sees the ramifications of the splitting of the atom, but the films always seem to be on their side. They always seem to be willing their protagonist to make the right choice, and the tragedy comes from the fact that they don't.
Yeah, it's part of the sort of thorny it's that sort of crown of thorns tangle that the end of this film is. The whole film is shrieking at John Baxter, don't.
Yeah. Please take the right
film.
Don't is even in the bloody title.
Right. Every element of the film is shrieking at him, don't do this. And yet everything that the film has fed him through has led him to this moment simultaneously. It's the cruelest engine. The reality of this film in all of its fractured, broken stained glass window glory is horrific.
And I think where that joins up with what we were saying before about this being intensely about gender and intensely about male-female relationships, marriages, etc. When I was watching this, The last time, this word kept tolling in my brain, and it's interesting because I don't believe it appears in the film, but it was the word responsibility. And there is that amazing line, and it's actually I mean, I was talking earlier about the scene where John is horrible to Laura when he shouts at her, you know, Christine is dead, and then bullies her into taking pills she doesn't want to take, etc. There's also a moment where Laura is horrible to John, where she's trying to get him to agree to let her. I mean, it's interesting that she feels she has to have his permission to do this, but it's clear that that's what's happening. She's trying to get him to let her spend time with the quote unquote sisters. Now, the only way in which she can ultimately get him to do that is to actually say something very passive aggressive and cruel to him, which is, you know, you said the children should play freely or something like that, which is essentially it amounts to saying it's your fault.
Yeah, you killed her.
Yeah, you killed her. It's your fault. I blame you.
So let me have this, you know, at least let me have this.
Exactly. You owe me this. And that it's that double-edged, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm doing a sort of MRA manosphere thing, because that's not where I'm coming from. But there is a double-edged thing in patriarchy where, you know, the male power comes with responsibility, and responsibility has this, again, like everything else in this film, you know, there's the above and there's the below, there's the actual thing and there's the reflection in the lake or the canal or whatever, there's the liminal line between the two, and you have the above and the below, etc. Responsibility has this double meaning, where responsibility means that, you know, it is like the polite, neutral way of framing power under a patriarchal system, a patriarchal relationship. You know, the father, the husband, etc. He has the responsibility. That's a way of saying he has the power. And the other thing is that then, if something goes wrong, he has the responsibility for that, and that is one of the ways in which, as we know, as feminism has pointed out very eloquently, patriarchy damages and cripples men as well.
Right, absolutely.
It inflicts responsibility on men in both respects, which means that it inflicts, you know, guilt and shame and inability to live up, etc., to these sorts of standards on men. Now, that ties in to me very much with, I mean, this happens in Venice. Venice is fascinating in English literature, in the English imagination, because we keep on associating Venice with death. You think about it, like there's death in Venice. I mean, I know that's a German novel and an Italian film, but it's about an Englishman, isn't it? I believe. There's Brideshead Revisited. People go there to die. Little Dorrit. People go to Venice to die in Little Dorrit. It's over and over again.
And although it's not, I think it's sort of Anglo-Franco as well, because the one that kept coming to my mind was Remembrance of Things Past. Which has direct parallels. I mean, you know, there is a journey to Venice, and there is the outfit. It's not a raincoat. It's a gown, isn't it? It's a gown worn by Albertine, the lost love, the red gown.
Yeah,
right.
So the red gown.
Yeah, and of course, then that bleeds into, you know, the actual history of Venice, where, of course, Jewish people had to wear red. I mean, this
takes me where I want to go, because, of course, you end up back at Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, yeah.
You end up with Shylock. I mean,
The Merchant of Venice, right?
Is a comedy, not a tragedy, but it is a play that is. It's very difficult for us now to interpret that play as a comedy in the way that people in Shakespeare's time would. To us, it seems like a very dark and difficult and disturbing play. And you have Othello, and as I think it was Fintan O'Toole pointed out, you know, setting a play in Venice in Shakespeare's time to the audience, it would be like today you set it in Wall Street or something like that. The audience knew what it meant. You know, it was a place of finance. And of course, Shakespeare is writing in the era of primitive accumulation. He's writing when the transition from the old feudal world to the new mercantile capitalist world is happening. Venice is kind of like the vanguard of that. You know, it's the and that's why it's a place where all these different ethnic identities can be discussed and examined. Like, you know, Shylock obviously is Jewish, and Othello is the Moor, and he's an outsider, and yet he has this paradoxical position of power where he can become the big general, but at the same time he's still subject to intense racial distrust. And this brings us back to tragedy, and tragedy is always about people caught in social contradictions. And ultimately, I think that's what this film is about. This is about a man caught in the social contradiction of patriarchy, and very fundamentally, it's about how women see him, or even more fundamentally than that, it's about how he, and by extension men generally, thinks he is seen by women. And that word responsibility, he is given the responsibility for caring for the family, and you can't, under any reasonable human judgment, blame him for what happens. But of course, he's going to blame himself, and she blames him, even if it's a tactic to escape his authority. At one point, she does blame him. So in this entire schema, this entire system, he has to take that responsibility. It's a byproduct of the power. And so where am I going with this? I've lost it again. But what you end up with then is a situation where I remember what it is. It's prophecy. That's the point. It's where tragedy connects with prophecy. Now, I've just watched the new version of Macbeth by Joel Cohen. It's brilliant. That's the story about, as is very famous, is very well known, a prophecy a series of prophecies come true because the prophecies are made. The person to whom the prophecies are made brings them about. And historically, this is one of the reasons why people who were suspected of prophecy, like John Dee, they were distrusted. They were persecuted. Women were persecuted as witches, partly because it was considered that they had the gift of prophecy. And historically, people thought, well, if you can foresee the future, then you might be making it happen. It was illegal in the Elizabethan era, when John Dee was doing people's horoscopes, and Simon Foreman, etc., people like that. It was illegal, or at least it was on the fringes of legality, because if you were able to prophesy when the Queen or the King or whoever would die, you might be in some way making that happen.
It's almost like inciting it to happen.
Exactly. And the thing in this film is that John has essentially the gift of prophecy. He is the one who foresees the future. He knows tragically just before, not half an hour before, but just seconds before, that Christine is going to die. He knows that he's going to die. He sees a vision of his own death, essentially.
Well, at the very beginning, he sees the red figure, doesn't he? From that moment, that's it.
Exactly.
That's the end. He's done.
And that's it. It's the spilling of water onto the photograph, or wine, or whatever it is. It's like, through his ability to foresee the future, he then makes it happen, and and he starts the entire chain of events. It's like it's always interpreted as the figure in the photograph, the red figure in the photograph, and then this spillage of liquid across the photograph, and the red puddle across the photograph, etc., is a foreshadowing or an omen. One of the interesting things I noticed is the echoes with the omen, actually, which we talked about. But you can equally look at it, if you buy into the supernatural reading of this, as John making that happen.
Well, that becomes overt towards the end of the film, doesn't it? Towards the end of the film, the actions he takes as a result of what he sees bring everything about. So and it's simultaneously like the most incredible capacity, and yet completely impotent, right?
It is. Yeah, it's absolutely right. Yeah, it is. And there you go. What better summary could you have of the position of a certain kind of man within a patriarchal family?
Right. Yeah,
it's not. I'm not necessarily sort of doing a kind of counterfactual reading of the film where actually John is a kind of wizard who makes things. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is this film is about how men interpret women or interpret more broadly their own situation within this sort of system. It's
it's about snare, isn't it? It's about
feeling of guilty, helpless responsibility. Yeah.
Well, what's germane to that is we are aware in the opening sequences of the film that clearly this is something that is not. It doesn't come to him in the moment that the slide is damaged, because we see this book, Beyond the Fragile Geometry of Space. He's already tried to deal with this. He's already tried to deal with this using vocabulary and structures that he thinks he's got a handle on. And so he's clearly, I mean, just going by the title of the book, okay, right, what we see beyond space is as purely geometric, and his work, of course, is engaged in going into the past, the archaeology, that what is beyond the fragile geometry of space. And even, when they're talking about, well, even a frozen lake is not flat, etc. But even insofar as that kind of, right, I better work this down, I better be rational about this, I better, I mean even the headmaster of the school is called Babbage, it's being nicely reinforced. And yet, of course, the prestige moment is this isn't going to work as a map to understand this situation. It's and indeed we're constantly faced, if we're going to run with this theme of sort of patriarchy and gender, as I sort of hinted at earlier, all the people he go, because I very much like that idea about it is how women perceive him. That's a definite part of it,
or how he thinks they do, or how he thinks he is perceived generally. Don't
look now, there's these two women looking at me, darling. But it's interesting that the people he goes to, who are, of course, more associated with order and establishment.
Yes, right.
Business owners, police inspectors, who are either terrible frauds or ill at ease with their own work, or overwhelmed by it, or that they're not quite what they appear. I mean, in fact, the very strong heteronormative and patriarchal thing is broken down by the hotelier for him as well. So the priest no longer believes the police.
Right.
Can't get a handle on it, and indeed it's murder after murder after murder.
The headmaster can't organize himself, and his wife ultimately takes over, right?
So it's but I think this comes out of this, partly out of this sort of how are people perceiving me, how are women perceiving me, or how do I think they're perceiving me? It's but also this kind of anathema about intuition. The anathema about faith. I don't like churches. And of course, as we said earlier, the irony is this is a man of prophetic or psychic intuition, which he cannot confront. And that's his downfall. His downfall is, this film is urging him to do one thing and he's going, nope. And then, of course,
his downfall is the power that he has.
Yeah, right. And it's when he starts embracing it, right? That's when it kills him. That's when it ultimately everything breaks down. It's when he embraces it,
because he's caught in the classic situation of the tragic hero, which is that he's caught in an essentially inescapable paradoxical situation. When he has the power, he can't use it. When he tries to use it, he doesn't have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that I mean, just on a purely emotional level, the final sequence is it. I don't know about you guys, but it leaves me breathless every time, even though every single damn beat of the damn thing.
I talked when we talked about The Witch about for long sections of the film just being completely unconsciously sort of leaning forward, tensed in my seat, not breathing, and the same thing happens to me in long stretches of this as well.
When Elliot and I chatted briefly last time, I was buzzing with this film. I was filled. I was completely filled.
It has
just
that effect,
surging with it. It was unbelievable.
If we were to, I'm still thinking back to earlier when Jack quite rightly saying about people bandying about the word symbolism, but not. But I'm not only for its literary significance, and therefore it sort of creates a kind of antecedent with Venice I'm talking about, but also some of the decisions around Venice. I mean, the idea that he disappears into some place which is labyrinthine, which is chaotic, but also it does symbolize, I guess, the central dichotomy. And if we maintain this idea of a man trying to sort of rationally work things out, who has a tendency towards the reductive, and the city they go to is really a kind of, I mean, on two levels. Number one, you're trying to create a solid structure on water,
right.
So it's doomed to fail, and indeed it sinks so many feet every year. But also in terms of its historical significance, about a place of mercantile capitalism, it kind of was for Europe, along with parts of Amsterdam and so on. What New York has become to America, a place that is simultaneously it and not considered it. Venice was the same. Venice was a part of Europe and simultaneously not. It was a part of that world and it wasn't. It occupying two ideas at once, as well as kind of two states at once. That it's a solid structure on water. It's not.
Well, again, it's these echoes all the way down, isn't it? It's this notion of doubles, of duplicates, of echoes, of reflections, of portrayals that informs every element of the film.
Well, Venice becomes a kind of echo chamber, doesn't it?
Right.
Because it is a city that is sort of almost hermetically sealed.
Yeah.
And
it is an echo chamber of meaning to the point where it's almost overdone. I mean, I don't know about you, but Venice is one of those things about the real world that sometimes makes me doubt that we are in the real world. Like it is so intensely strange and paradoxical and freighted. It is a city on water. It is constantly dying. Venice is constantly in the process of crumbling and dying and sinking into the sea, and yet it never actually quite goes.
And it's also a city of both romance and death. And yet it's all of these things all bound together, which this film is, of course. It's about both those things. It's Eros and Thanatos, right?
Yes, but he puts a version of Venice on that, let's face it, not many of us have seen.
Yeah,
which is Venice in winter,
right? And the underbelly.
Venice in winter. It's
it's dirty and grey, and we get to see these dark back streets, as you say.
Nowhere.
Yeah,
and
that literally roads to nowhere. Yeah.
There's hardly anyone there. But
there's another great bit where the night where they're going to the party, I think, and they get lost and they end up down this back street, which just ends in like a dead end with water, and they see a rat, etc. And then they get separated, and then they hear the scream, and he sees the figure in the red coat for the first time, and then he calls across to her. She's on the bridge, isn't he? And he's in the street, and he calls across to her, "I found the real world." And then he leads her back into public, commercial, nightlife Venice.
Yeah.
Before that, before he has that line, he leads them into a dead end, and he says, "I know this place."
I know this place.
And it's a throwaway line. There's no context at all. They don't explain it, and then he turns away.
Yeah,
but then the whole soundscape. I mean, this is a film when they are in the streets.
Responsibility as the father, the husband, the boss, is to lead her out of there, back to the real world.
But there's this odd thing with the soundtrack where we constantly hear dogs bark, cats mew, kids are heard but unseen, and it's haunting this kind of grown-up world, But it's very funny with Venice, because I've been there 5 times, never in winter, always spring or autumn, and it is as you say, it's freighted with all this stuff and how enigmatic it is. And I had quite the most bizarre experience in Venice about 15-16 years ago, where we went.
Don't tell me you saw Roger Moore driving a gondola through the streets and a pigeon did a double take. Is that
close? But let's go. But we got hopelessly lost, because
you've gone a bit quiet.
Yeah,
we got hopelessly lost, of course, because that's what happens in Venice, and that you can't go by any map, and you can't use the numbers on the doors because they're all out of order, and everything
just breaks down.
It just breaks
like an Escher.
And we got lost to the point of panicky, and I started to recognize graffiti, so I managed to trace our way back by the graffiti. But we sort of found a place where we both went, we're back in the real world. We know where we are now. And there was a bar there, and I said, I really think we need a drink after that, because we got lost to the point of feeling that sort of heat rising in you. And we were pretty unsettled. And we went into this bar, and it was I sort of remember this bar, but not from this vantage point, and we must have come out the other side, which would sort of make sense. But then we had the classic Venice Don't Look Now, ended up in a kind of another portal of time space, where we went in. We were having a drink.
The portal to fairy, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah, it is. And we're having a drink, and there's a guy next to us, and he sort of, darling, there's two old ladies over there looking at, and he notices me and sort of smiles and nods, and then there's a sort of nudge, and the place, I just think, oh well, just being friendly, I guess. And as the sort of hour went on, the place became livelier, and they started playing music, and more people came in, and a lot of younger people came in, and it spilled out into the street, and we went out into the street and had a cigarette. I was still smoking then, and then suddenly we had people around us, and I don't speak Italian. I didn't inherit that from my father, unfortunately. He can, and we were getting questions, and we were sort of piecing it together. And my partner at the time said, "They think you're someone." And I said, "What?" I said, they are and it was going like wildfire. So it was like having slipped into another dimension. I was being given drinks. I was having photographs taken, and people were coming. And I said, "Who the fuck do they think I am? And how am I going to, just get off this pedestal they've put me on without it, causing violence because I'm, being someone under false pretense and everything." And
look, guys, I know I look like him, but I'm really not.
It was one of those situations. You think, oh, Venice is everything they said it is. We've just ended up somewhere completely different. We've ended up at a completely different plane of existence, and we might still be in that plane. Actually, maybe I was someone. Who knows? I could have been a contender. But it was
again, it's that Mandela effect thing, right?
Totally. I said, but I've actually lived it. It's not just been on a film. There was this bizarre episode, and I went to Venice and got lost and ended up a star.
You accidentally slipped into the parallel dimension where you were.
Jack, always have been in.
Jack, you were saying that Venice, by its very nature, is the kind of place that makes you question reality, that makes you think that maybe we are in some sort of weird sort of inception, dreamscape, or simulation. Yeah, that kind of story makes me think that. Yeah, because it ties too closely and too poetically into the themes that we've attached to it through this film, right?
Yeah.
It seems too perfect. It seems too pristine. And that phenomena is what the film is talking about, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But the fairy thing, of course, you were saying, but it's also how it uses a sort of patchwork of myth as well.
Yeah, right.
Obviously, we have the associations of trolls under bridges and Red Riding Hood, and all
the triune
these
goddesses, the seers, the seer women. Yeah, of course. Is Christine the daughter or the wife? I always get them confused.
Christine's the daughter.
Laura's the wife.
Laura's the wife. That's right. Laura becomes one of the triune goddesses by the end, of course.
And I still don't know whether she does.
The mother and the crone,
absolutely,
yeah.
And I still don't know whether if in one of those alternate takes, because Rogue frames it interesting. I don't know how much we're meant to believe it's her being pulled out,
right,
of the water as well. In one of those.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really hard. He half obscures the frame, and he puts in certain signifiers, but then others that completely contradict it. And so therefore it's still a real question mark over whether, probably deliberately so, it is simultaneously Laura and not Laura being pulled out of the water.
What do we make of her last spoken line when she's reaching through the gate and she doesn't say darling, she says darlings?
That is incredible, isn't it?
Right.
As I say, I think this film is fundamentally about how men think or feel like women perceive them. And I think if we therefore, I think, have to see everything this film depicts women as doing as filtered through male perception.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of literally true, because the original story is by a woman who she literally thought of her writing self as male. Right.
That is amazing. I love that so much.
And then it's a script based on a story that is by a woman, by a man. Right. And so you get to this point where you have to view every utterance by a female character, every action of a female character in this film via this kind of hall of mirrors, where what you're watching is what a man thinks a woman would think and say and do. And of course, huge swathes of the fiction that we consume is actually that, because because we live in the world we live in, sadly.
Yeah, right.
The vast majority of fiction about people of all genders is written by men. And so, I always wonder about this. We have this idea about how ordinary people spoke in the past, don't we? Right?
We do.
And of course, to a huge extent, I mean, I know there is actual scholarship and historians work on this, et cetera, to reconstruct the common colloquial speech of people in the past, etc. But a huge amount of our popular idea about how people in the past spoke, common people, working class people, etc., comes from the writings of people of the upper and middle classes. And look, I'm sorry, but I do not trust Charles Dickens and M.R. James and people like that, etc., as much as I love them.
P.G. Woodhouse, etc.
Exactly, to have an unbiased perception, let alone, representation, an unbiased personal cognition of how the working class people around them speak. So, when Sam Vella in Mr. Pickwick talks, we find it terribly charming, and we might take that at face value. But that is the speech patterns of ordinary working class people filtered through the perceptions of fucking bots. Right. And so what we have to a huge extent in our imaginary as a culture, men and women, of women, is a picture of women constructed from culture, created, written, shaped, controlled by men.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
And this film does that, but this film is kind of conscious of it. That's one of the reasons why it's incredibly interesting and valuable, because to sort of veer vaguely back in the direction of the question you asked, what we're getting at that moment is therefore what, in some sense, a male presence or a male author function, or John himself, if you like, imagines a woman saying at that moment.
Right.
Now, what does the utterance actually mean? Does it mean that she, I mean, I don't have a pat answer to this, but does it mean that she perceives the figure in red as, in some sense, Christine?
Some sense, right.
A reincarnation of Christine. Now,
and is that viable? I mean, as an interpretation, is that viable?
This is really the key question, isn't it? The figure at the end, the killer at the end, who is that? That really is what it comes down to. Now, is it in some sense Christine? It's kind of like the initial shock of the end is that it's not. The film kind of, or at least a kind of surface reading of the film, turns upon the figure turns around, and it's not an angelic little girl. It's what it is instead. Yeah. Now, the visual of that person and the subsequent action of that figure doesn't actually settle it. No,
it does not. In the short story, it's absolute. It's just a serial killer, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
In the film, it's much more ambiguous.
Yeah, because I mean, it's immediately followed by the montage we talked about, where John runs through kind of the film we've just watched and kind of searches for an answer to that very question: who is this? Why is this happening? Etc. What does it mean? Literally, what does this mean that it is happening? And you could view this, if you wanted to, as the female revenge upon the man who has that responsibility under patriarchy. But what I think the interesting thing that this film, ultimately, the real key to this for me, is that this film is a hall of mirrors. And what it is saying is that that's what the male perspective perceives the female attitude as being. So John is, in a sense, slain in revenge by some form of vengeful, wrathful female figure, because he perceives that as being what others should happen to him.
Yeah, it's almost, I suppose you could read it in that regard as almost like a patriarchal prescription of what he feels should happen to him on some level, because he's failed, right? In his role, he has failed.
Yeah, and he assigns the role of the vengeful, the punisher, the executioner, to a female figure, a quote-unquote ugly female figure, a crone female figure.
Right.
And that is really always the role that the crone figure has, one of the roles anyway, that the crone figure has played in the patriarchal male imagination. And we need look no further than the weird sisters in Macbeth that I talked about before.
Which again are replicated in this film, right?
Yeah.
And linking back even to the witch, which we covered already.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, I remember the one. It's interesting because so the first time I saw this on television, I remember the real profound sense of horror and tragedy I got then was the notion that because I like this, I think that's a really interesting look at it. When I first saw it, I remember just the horror of error was the thing that occurred to me, which was because Heather cannot see in the conventional sense, and I think the implication is she was born blind, whereas obviously she has this other kind of perception. Because she has, it always occurred to me, because she had no context for Christine, that the figure that she thought she saw smiling in between them was actually laughing at him, and it was always the figure at the end.
Interesting.
Now this is me flipping back to a basically a child, an adolescent's interpretation of it, but I remember quite strongly thinking it's a mistake. Oh my gosh, this all rests on the fact that this woman with second sight, or whatever you choose to call it, with some sort of cognition, is wrong. What she thinks she sees is an innocent girl smiling between her two parents, the spirit of an innocent girl smiling to her, but she has no context for what a little girl looks like because she's been blind from birth. And she's missed, and of course the realization comes later. I've got it wrong. It's not what I've seen, but that was an interpretation from a while ago.
But I don't think that's incompatible though, because if you view this as a tragedy and you view it as a tragedy in the vein of Macbeth, and many tragedies, Macbeth is just one of them, contain the element of prophecy tragically misunderstood, prophecy brought about by people trying to fight against it, etc. If you view it that way and you see the chain of events in some sense, caused by John's foreknowledge, his ability to see the future actually being in some sense the inadvertent causing of the future, and therefore the death of Christine as in some sense being caused by his what's the bloody word? His premonition, that's it, is caused by his premonition of it. Then what you see is a chain of events which brings that figure at the end into existence. It's not that the figure is waiting for him all the way through, right from before the film starts, so to speak,
it just
and that's
has
why it's in the
to
photograph,
occur, doesn't it? It has to be, right?
He brings it about. I mean, that figure in the photograph could be anything. The figure at the end is not necessarily the same figure, but it comes into existence as in its form at the end as a result of the chain of events that begins with John's bringing this dreaded outcome, to use the psychological jargon, into existence. And if you view it that way, then if you wanted to see the spectre or the shade or the figure that is seen by the psychic sister as real and actually present, then you could see it. You could absolutely make it compatible with the reading you've just given,
and indeed you can really make that connection with Macbeth, because the dual function of I am from a woman born untimely ripped, says Macduff, is both looked at one way. That's the sisters, rather like the sisters in Don't Look Now, having their moment of laughter. They have pulled this trick, but at the same time you can push that away and say, well, no, the prophecy has integrity. It has always been this. It is not a trick. This is part of the and so both work well. The end of Don't Look Now, rather, as with the end of Macbeth the play. You don't have to come down hard on either interpretation. They kind of all stack up. rather like all the alternatives stack up. But because certainly that revelation of Macduff, it can be read as you've been cosmically played, Maccas.
Yeah.
Or it can be read, no, this was nothing that was not a possibility all along. You chose to interpret what you were given the way you were given it, and it's not as if their speech was unambiguous from the start. And so on and so on, and you've listened to your wife as John Baxter listens to his wife. You've listened to other people as Macbeth listens to other people, and it's shaped everything that leads to this moment. So I agree. It's not necessarily this is always going to be at the end or in the heart of the labyrinth waiting for you. A man who cannot be killed, or a crone who's going to slash your neck open. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. It's not a kind of. It doesn't necessarily have to work as catching the main character out, although it can have a thrill looking at it that way. You can get a kind of thrill of horror looking at it that way.
And that is, I mean, I think this movie does a wonderful job of having its cake and eating it, because it manages to give you that thrill of horror at the same time as having all these ambiguities and complexities. This is why it's a major, very important work of art, I would say.
How did you guys first come to it, by the way? How did you first come to Don't Look Now?
For me, it was very much like in the manner that we've talked about with other things before, which is, I was at that age where I was just, hungry to see and experience everything that was of cultural significance, and it came on telly. So I just just watched.
Whereas I was, as I said earlier, I was definitely guided towards it by my dad is like that. I mean, my dad was always, I think he's always been a frustrated teacher. He was always the one who would be like, I've got something to tell you about. I've got something to introduce you to. That was his, big. I mean, funnily enough, same with Macbeth, which was my introduction to Shakespeare. By my dad, because he was like, I've got this thing to tell you, and because he knew it would give me.
Interestingly, my introduction to Shakespeare was The Merchant of Venice.
right.
But it was something like a late BBC Two, and it was like, and there's a wonderful childlike quality about my dad as well, because I can still, because he said it so often, it's like, oh, go on, let him stay up and watch this. He would be like that. My mother would be like, are you sure this is? And every time she said this, so she never learned this idea of, are you sure this is suitable? And it's like, oh, it'll be okay.
It's sage advice. It really is. I like the fact that your dad trusted you to watch it, right? I don't
think it was anything to do with trust in me. He simply has no idea, and it's to this day. I mean, we make a joke of it when we meet up occasionally. If the subject comes, he has no idea, and now he says, oh gosh, he said, what a bad parent. I said, no, I said, it was fine. I said, it's okay. I'm not going to say it didn't do me any harm. It probably did on many profound levels, but you were clearly quite sure of yourself at the time, and I got to see this wonderful stuff or hear this wonderful stuff.
Right, it makes for a very interesting imagination in the child, doesn't it?
Yeah, he was good on that front, and just that kind of something to introduce to you. I've got something to read to you, or there's something I want you to try and read, or there's this film I want you to watch, or always the same music as well.
Beats my dad, who was like, "Shut up, the cricket's on."
Oh God Almighty! But my introduction,
I liked it.
My introduction to Don't Look Now is completely different. It's unlike most things, which usually starts my mum and her VHS collection. That actually wasn't the case with this one. As I say, I don't even know if there was a VHS of this or not. If there was, it was very limited and very difficult to get a hold of because we didn't have it. And I didn't see it on the television either. So whether the airing was like, I don't know, earlier, it was in the earlier from my period, I don't know. I came to it very late on when there was actually a DVD release of it. I'd heard about it. I'd heard about it many times. So
you were, quote unquote, a grown up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was at university. Yeah, I was. I think 21 when I first saw Don't Look Now. In fact, what I did was I saw it in a very old, ailing HMV, as they all were at the time. Alongside the new release of The Wicker Man. and I bought them both. And
well, that's amazing because you probably know that when this was originally released, it was on a double feature with The Wicker Man.
I learned that later.
We spoke about this briefly last night, because I mean I adore The Wicker Man, and yet at the same time it is very hard to believe those films are contemporaries.
Yeah,
very hard to believe.
Very bizarre, but that was a red letter day. I went home and watched both of those films back to back and was bouncing around like a lunatic. Afterwards, I was absolutely...
I'm actually wondering, Jack, is there a possibility Don't Look Now might have been in one of the Videodrome seasons or something like that?
It's quite possible.
Because it certainly has that thing, and one of the things that I think maybe it didn't get a VHS release is that unusually for a film of that genre, and it might have been because it was rogue, but it acquired a kind of almost art film status.
It did, yeah. I mean, that's how I came to it. A lot. It was at that time where, when you start actually acknowledging that created media is indeed a created thing, and there are people behind it, and you become interested in both the process and the creators themselves. It was at that time when I was reading lots of biographies and lots of interviews with film creators and writers, and so many of the writers and creators I admire talked about this film that I'd never seen. So many of them. It took on like a legendary mythic status in my mind.
That is a really interesting moment in a person's development, if they're going to be the kind of person that thinks about and engages with art their entire life. That moment when, as you say, you realize all of a sudden that works of art, quote unquote, are not just grown, they're not just there, they are produced, they are created by people, and I think that one of the interesting things about fans in the older sense, because it's a word that's sort of diversified and taken on all sorts of new meanings now, but certainly fan in the sense that I thought of myself as a fan when I was younger, very specifically a Doctor Who fan first, and then a fan of other things later. One of the things about fans in that sense might be that we get there a bit before other people, because we care so much about, has the next season been commissioned? Who's the new Doctor going to be? Has the script editor changed, etc.,
so we start peeking behind the curtain a little earlier, perhaps.
We do, maybe, or certainly from roughly speaking our generation. It's probably different now, because young people are so media literate now, in a way that we weren't. I don't think.
I do recall that, like, very early on, because I was a huge fan of fantasy fiction when I was very young. I used to love C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, Tolkien, my God, there was a time when I could tell you everything about Middle Earth. I mean, literally everything, like dates, ridiculous. But I do recall, even from that very young age, being interested in Tolkien as a man and knowing quite a lot about him, as I was and still am in Barker.
For me, it was very much Terrance Dicks, because I remember very, very clearly sort of the process of going from thinking, there is just this arrangement of letters that's on the spine of all my target novelizations to there is a person called Terrance Dicks who writes these. And then later on, there is the moment when you see a photograph for the first time, and then you learn, that he was the script editor of the television show, etc., etc. So for me, in all sorts of ways, Terrance Dicks is a pivotal figure, and that for me, he kind of symbolizes that moment for me, that process, I should say.
It's fascinating now, isn't it, to think about that process, because of course technology and the way we communicate has changed that dynamic completely. There was a time when these people, like when we were young, would have been very distant and almost mythical figures, no matter how much you learned about them or how much you saw them on television or whatever. But now you can literally go and talk to them.
Well, look, one of my earliest memories is of the Doctor Who that was on television when I was a tiny child. I was plonked in front of the telly and I was 4 years old or whatever, and Doctor Who was on, and it was season 18, which means the script editor was a guy called Christopher H. Bidmead. And that has absolutely shaped my life. And I've had interactions with Christopher H. Bidmead on Twitter.
Yeah.
And that still kind of blows my brain apart, when I think about it.
I wrote a piece for a website I write for called The Ginger Nuts of Horror on Clive Barker's novel Sacrament. And I got a mail through from the husband and wife team that run his social media, and they said, "Oh, by the way, Clive has read your piece and he was very flattered by it."
Oh, that's lovely.
Wow.
That's about as close as I've gotten, and I basically fell off my chair.
I'm not surprised, but that fan gene thing is, I think that there's definitely something there, because I basically, the second time I watched Don't Look Now, I sort of got back to Rogue because, as is well known by the people in this virtual room, of being a fan of David Bowie, and then certain things, whether it is like Terence Dicks or David Bowie or Clive Barker, they become like search engines into other things. And I remember,
of course.
But I was really Rogue really interested me in the sense of because he is so guided by this idea or this philosophy of the interconnectedness of things, and nothing is a coincidence. And when he came to The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is the next film in this roughly 3 sequence, this
it's
trilogy.
Like a triptych, isn't it?
Yeah, like a trip. In fact, that is a better way, though, because trilogy makes it sound more like it's complete in a different way. It is more like a triptych. I like that. Thank you. This idea, about life isn't linear; it's sideways, which which comes through in Don't Look Now, and the fact that he worked with David Bowie in 1975, that it just made so much sense for me when I rediscovered Rogue that way, because the fact that they have both been kind of in their own ways experimenting with the sort of fractured nature of time and ourselves, because that film was meant to star Peter O'Toole.
Right.
Thomas Newton was meant to be played by the studio wanted Peter O'Toole. And Rogue had this thing, a very instinctive casting thing anyway. I mean, as I said earlier, he really wanted Sutherland and Christie and was prepared to wait for them. But he'd also had this notion quite ahead now. I mean, we've sort of grown used to this with filmmakers, but he was kind of an oddity at the time for doing this, was not always wanting actors. He had used Jagger famously in performance, but the thing with Bowie was he'd seen the Alan Yentob documentary Cracked Actor, where and there's a section. I mean, you don't have to be a fan of David Bowie. I think that is just one of the most amazing documentaries ever, because it just shows a man in free fall before he falls to earth. I mean, David Bowie is in one of the most bizarre places at that point in his life, through a combination of mostly cocaine and just being in this very rarefied atmosphere of Los Angeles, which of course he would escape. But there's a section of it where he is describing in detail how he makes lyrics with cut-ups, which is obviously the old Ferlinghetti, William Burroughs thing, right back to the Dada thing, Tristan Tzara, all those guys. But literally taking diaries or short stories or poems or lyrics for other songs and cutting them up and rearranging them. And of course, Rogue gets super excited by this, and it's like, oh my God! Not only does this guy look otherworldly, I mean, he's painfully thin, his eyes are different, and he seems to have a similar angle on things as me, the way he's talking, and he consequently knocked back the insistence on O'Toole and brought David Bowie in. But it really, but watching, in fact, it's something I might do once the dust settles a bit for me for watching Don't Look Now recently, because something like this, you're afraid to cheapen it. Not that you possibly can, but there's that worry about repeat viewings. But to watch them back to back, I think, and see them, to see that journey of that approach to narrative and time and memory, threading its way through those films, and then to work very closely with someone who is absolutely shares that those ideas about it's not dysfunction, that there is something perhaps in the idea of it's a very 70s thing, because we're gearing up towards the break to postmodernism, aren't we? The idea of itself and all that, but seeing it come to some kind of culmination in that film. I really want to do that again. It's wow. Yes, I think that. But as I say, it's the fan gene, isn't it? I rediscovered Rogue because of Bowie. I mean, I probably would have gone back to Don't Look Now and things like that eventually, but I think it just hastened the journey. But so I mean,
I don't think I'll watch this film again for years. To be honest, it's too much for me personally.
It's so potent, isn't it?
Yeah, on a visceral level. I mean, I had a similar thing with Jack mentioned The Witch. Exactly that experience where it is just too much. It is just too much emotionally.
It's like Rogue says, isn't it? No one looks at Van Gogh's sunflowers and sees sunflowers, and I think that's it right there. There's everything else that comes through that you can't,
Yeah, it's very rare. It's a very rare phenomenon, but I do seek it out. I mean, it's something I absolutely, it's an experience I absolutely adore. And I sort of demand of media, I want it to make me feel things, even if that thing is very negative. But yeah, this one fills me with so many emotions and so many contradictory thoughts and ambiguities that it kind of leaves me awash afterwards. It leaves me kind of dissolute,
Yeah, it's a wonderful example of cinema as a polysemic, open art form. That can, because there's just this kind of inherent trapdoor in cinema as an inherently representational art form, unlike like abstract art or poetry or music necessarily. Cinema is one of the inherently like narrative fiction. It's one of the inherently representational art forms,
of course,
and the great. I would argue the great works of art are in those forms are the works that stay within them, but at the same time, open a crack in them so that they manage to be both representational and to suggest all sorts of interior dimensions to what they represent. And that is there's very few films that.
And there's something about this film
represent that as well as this
of the delight of implication and suggestion. It's very hard to do in prose fiction, I think, is that inevitably, if you certainly with modernist fiction onwards, you end up in someone's head, or even if you were a godlike narrator who has sort of control over the universe, that it becomes language in and of itself is very slippery, which is very often a help, but there's almost a sort of super control available to you. And one of the things about film, and particularly if you're a very
somebody said that once, and I can't think who it was, but somebody said modernism finds complexity, but it does so by focusing on small spaces, like it focuses on the insides of heads or the workings of language. And sorry to interrupt.
No, it's a very it's a good point. But but with the film, and it kept coming to this film, is that those implications and suggestions which Rogue just lets go. I mean, partly it's in the as you say, the relationship between John and Laura, which is such a window on the uncomfortable truth that I think everyone in a monogamous relationship has to confront, is that beyond all the platitudes and everything, and the insistence that there are cruelties. They're unavoidable.
There are sort of mutual abuses, right?
It's just like a slow motion violence sometimes, and these things come back to haunt you. It is words spoken pointedly, points made, and no one's a saint, and that is very well done. But it's even things like the whole like deliberately almost untouched narrative with the brother who doesn't get a line, and there's this part of you who thinking, this is a couple who are suffering really intense PTSD. They've left their only other child alone in school, which we all know from bitter experience what a school is like. We've been through school, and a boarding school as well.
That's right.
And you think, my gosh, there's a whole part of the narrative which he's just,
he's got to be grieving as well. Probably under the circumstances of the death, as we see in the devastating opening sequence,
he was probably
he was there. He probably feels guilty. I mean, children do that anyway. It's an attempt to control. They find ways in which things are their fault.
Yes.
But that's an impulse he's going to have instantly already. And of course, again, under patriarchy, he's already going to have been started the process of socialization into that dual-edged sense of responsibility again. But he was there. He was physically there.
Yeah,
and
saw
again,
it happen.
He does something not unlike what his father does. His father does that double-edged thing where, it could be prophecy, premonition, or it could be in some sense causing, where he spills the wine or the water or whatever it is into the photograph. The boy rides his bike over a pane of glass and breaks it.
Or the glass, yeah.
So there's a symbolic action there which could very easily be interpreted as the cause, the causal factor.
That's the initial vandalism, right?
The surface of reality has just been ruptured. And then the idea of that runs throughout the story of neglected children. The accusation from her, you said that they could roam free, etc. But this other child is definitely neglected. I mean, they whatever gloss they put on it, but they leave without him.
He's effectively thrown away.
And they've lost one, and you think, oh, they want to drag the other one closer to them, but it's extraordinary.
You are immersed in John's perspective by that point. But even the detail of the boy is injured at school, and again, it's another fall. Falls are recurrent in this film.
Are definitely a thing.
John has a fall,
and he's called John as well. He's Johnny, and it's John all this doubling and fracturing.
And the priest's father has just died in a fall.
A fall, yes, of course.
And at that moment, with all this context, they get this call: your son's had a fall, your son's injured. Even in that moment, John stays in Venice to do his job. He sends her. I mean, she volunteers, but that's quite something, isn't it?
It really is.
It's that what I think Rogue is very good at doing there is he puts the uncanny into the domestic. They're just slightly off into the domestic. So it's not just a film that plays out as uncanny and odd in the major key. It's playing it out in the minor key as well.
In the sex scene as well, the sex scene carries. You were talking about, it's just the inescapable, inherent nature of a marriage, or we should maybe say, any intimate relationship, that there's going to be cruelties. And one of the things that's so amazing about the sex scene or the love scene is that the myth about it is that they actually just filmed Sutherland and Christie having sex, which we know. I understand why people think that, because it's the most outside of porn, it's the most realistic screen sex.
It's contentious, isn't it? It's contentious. It really is.
We know pretty much as a matter of fact, unless everybody's lying, we know pretty much as a matter of fact that they didn't. It was very carefully done and very well choreographed, etc. But the thing is, it looks incredibly real, and the reason it looks incredibly real is that it's kind of awkward. It captures It captures that thing about real sex, which is, you don't get it in fantasy sex on screen, because in fantasy sex everything just glides around like well-oiled machinery. But in reality, of course, you're dealing with two bodies in space controlled by two completely separate brains, and of course there's going to be bumping into each other, knocking shins against each other and shit like that. It is awkward. Sex is just kind of awkward.
It kind of is.
Captures it, even down to come down here, move up there, I'm pulling you this way, etc. And there's there are moments where it kind of looks like soft violence, even though it clearly in the context it's not. In the context, you can tell that it is. It straightforwardly is a loving act, despite all the complexities in the relationship. It doesn't go in for that kind of vulgar cynicism. It is just a loving act. But even in the context of a complex relationship. But even in the context of being a loving act, there is just a physical friction of this act, which inherently contains it.
There's an echo of violence inherent, isn't it? It doesn't matter how loving it is. The act by its very nature echoes violence.
The potential is always there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those bumping shins, they contain the potential for worse.
But I think there's an interesting awkwardness that runs through the film that might not necessarily be visible so much to us now because we're somewhat on the fulcrum by dint of age, but there are certain ways that films were assembled and television was assembled that we don't have to do anymore because of people's levels of media literacy. But this film does, for the time, things that would have been considered awkward, certainly outside of something like the French New Wave or something like that. So Rogue does without a great deal of information, and I think for an audience watching this in 1972, when it was first shown, we don't get any shots of airports. We don't get any shots of John and Laura sat at a loss next to each other in their first or second class seats on the plane. We're just bang into Venice, and
it's a little like Barbarian Sound Studio.
It's almost as though transition is done away with.
But we're so used to that now. And again, it sort of taps into that point you were making earlier, Jack, about how our idea of people is pushed through largely male, and given the class of writers from rather the same with this. We have no ready link to how people watch films like this in 1972, except through a little bit of reading up on it. But the idea of doing without establishing shots, the idea of doing out transition shots, or those kinds of edits, dissolves, was something that happened a little bit with Truffaut and some experimental films in the 60s, but for a more or less mainstream movie, it's
stylistically radical, isn't it?
Even in the film itself, the disorientation that we still feel in it must have been, times 10 for the audience watching it then, and just through the simple. Well, not necessarily simple, but just through the act of how it's assembled.
Even in The Wicker Man, which this was in the double bill with The Wicker Man. Wicker Man's a great film. It's truly a significant, great piece of cinema. But you get conventional stuff like establishing shots and how he arrives in the boat, and you see him arriving in the boat, etc., etc.
It's almost the one thing you can't do is the one thing you wish so much you could do is not just is to have the authentic experience. It's that it's just wanting both at the same time. It is wanting your cake and eating it. It is wanting to watch it from this vantage point or experience it from this vantage, but also to have a flavour. It was something, if you remember, George, we were talking about last week briefly, in that I'm obviously on a bit of a run at this moment with this genre, and I thought, I haven't seen Midsummer since 2019.
Fucking Midsummer.
So I decided to rewatch Midsummer, and I love Midsummer. But I realised, I said this to George, I started to giggle about 10 minutes in, because I realised that there's this thing I do with films that are maybe, say, less than 10 years old, or maybe even 15 years old. I try to imagine I'm watching them 20 years on. And it was a sort of semi-conscious thing, and I realized the reason I was doing it is because when you're confronted by something in your own moment, sometimes the potency and the power of it is somewhat lost on you, because it's using, if you like, a vocabulary, or a visual vocabulary, or it's in a context that you so readily know. One of the delights, of course, about Don't Look Now is watching something on that grimy film. And it's been assembled in a particular way, and because we've got such a distance on it now, it is we get a very different kind of profundity watching it, as I'm sure the original people who watched it did, not having seen a film put together quite like this.
Right, but we have that strange thing of hindsight as well. I
was sort of manufacture hindsight when I it was wonderful. I had a great time with it, and funnily enough, I watched Get Out right after it, and
my God,
some crossover between those films as well.
Wow, going straight for the Disturbia then, yeah.
These two are definitely potential.
For absolutely. But it's a strange phenomenon, isn't it? It's a strange phenomenon. Watching something like Don't Look Now as even a 21-year-old in the 2000s, and understanding that the influence and DNA of this film is already in cinema itself, is already in culture. So you have a very particular, strange foreknowledge of it, of its nature, a very different experience from those people in 1972 watching it for the first time.
And even the way it plays on, because it is a film that, it is ostensibly horror. It's certainly a horror film, but it is not a conventional horror movie.
No.
And yet it's riffing on, perhaps up at that point, one of the most famous scenes in horror cinema, which is James Whale's Frankenstein. It is the creature throwing the girl into the pond. I mean, it's almost using that foreknowledge and then putting this,
also
this
riffing on
horrible
Psycho.
domestic twist.
I was going to say the influence of Hitchcock is huge.
Yeah.
There is a certain not just stylistically. I mean, there's so much of you can see almost you can see Vertigo and whatnot, all just through this, but also that sort of bomb under the table Hitchcockian thing, where the audience have a perspective that the characters don't. Something is going to happen. You don't necessarily know what it is.
Du Maurier Hitchcock link is really interesting, isn't it? Because Hitchcock filmed several Du Mauriers.
Rebecca, yeah.
And even here, where Hitchcock, technically speaking, isn't involved. He's looming in the shadows, isn't he?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, it's almost as though Rogue really only. He's just sort of, just lifting the lid on the process that bit more, but an awful lot owes to Hitchcock's methods and techniques. But it's quite
Hitchcock's
striking.
a fascinating figure because he really does span the fulcrum of the decline of the studio system. Because he comes up in British cinema and then he moves to Hollywood and he's very much in the studio system. He was working with Selznick, etc. And then he's still making movies right the way through to the early 70s, roundabout, roughly contemporary with this, when the studio system has gone with the wind, to use the and you can trace the death of the studio system through his films, from Rebecca through Psycho, and The Birds. Again, you could do a study of cinema in America, the decline of studio cinema from I think it's Universal releases The Birds, but it's not the studio system as the studio system existed when he made Rebecca. You could use those two films as but what was I saying? Oh yeah. Don't Look Now is one of the movies that is mentioned by Frederick Jameson in his famous essay about The Shining, historicism in The Shining. And I think what he says is that, this wave of auteurs Kubrick and Roeg and people like this. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce Roeg. I would say Roeg, but it's probably Rogue.
I mean, I've heard it pronounced Rogue. But. Who cares?
But whichever.
It could be anything we want.
he's one of that generation of auteur directors who came up in the 70s, and they are, a lot of them anyway, are very distinct for employing genre categories as ways of negotiating the fracturing of cinema after the decline of the studio system. And Hitchcock's a fascinating figure in that, because Hitchcock turned his name into a kind of studio of one, didn't he? He turned himself into a brand. He was one of those very few film directors whose name went above the title. You sold films on the basis that it was a Hitchcock movie.
Yeah, it was a genre in and of itself, right?
Well, yeah, in very much the same way that audiences in the 30s and 40s knew that if they went to an RKO picture, they were going to get one type of picture. If they went to an MGM picture, they were going to get a different type of picture. If they went to a Hitchcock picture, they knew they were going to get a Hitchcock type of picture. And Hitchcock comes out of the studio system, and as I say, he's negotiating that fractured landscape. And then that generation of cinematic auteurs who, with all the problems inherent in the idea of the auteur, they're coming up in the wake of Hitchcock, and what they're doing is almost a kind of it's weird, because very similar studio of one thing happened with Kubrick and Roeg and people like this, but at the same time they are not making this variations on the same type of film over and over again in the way that, I mean, that's a bit reductive of Hitchcock, but there's an essential truth.
It's fair. It is fair.
Whereas Kubrick went from science fiction to war movie to horror film to and Roeg does almost exactly the same thing.
Very similar. In fact, Kubrick kind of made that his brand, didn't he? Just not doing the same thing, doing something different every single time.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. The same obsessions and anxieties guide Roeg through very different kinds of films. I mean, this idea, as I said, certainly across the three, I think it bleeds into Insignificance as well much later on, but of time, memory, perception, the fractured life, everything existing on the same plane of existence somehow, the synchronicity of things. It's obviously something that he can't break away from. He keeps just coming at it from.
He returns again and again,
from different vantage points and different, the science fiction of The Man Who Fell to Earth, or the horror of Don't Look Now, or the whatever Walkabout is. I mean,
whatever the conclusions you can draw from that.
And as I say, right up to Insignificance, which is the most extraordinary film. I don't know if either of you have seen Insignificance. It's really.
I haven't actually even seen Walkabout, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, Insignificance is a film from the tail end of the 80s, and it is pretty much a play. That is, it is a film play. It's about Marilyn Monroe meeting Einstein. And there's a sort of fragment of
I hope it's respectful of Marilyn, because I'm kind of protective of Marilyn.
It's fascinating because they meet and she's it's at a point where she's going out with a very, very famous baseball player, and she sort of seeks solace with Einstein, and they really hit it off. But Tony Curtis is in it, playing one of his sort of last big roles as a senator, and it's that he's really kind of self-sabotaging his matinee idol past, with Rogue. It's a very, very interesting film, and it all turns on the the bomb and everything, but it's great. And no, it's the actress who plays Marilyn Monroe, whose name escapes me at the moment. She is absolutely fantastic. But it's really wonderful. But it's taking a lot of the things that come through in Don't Look Now and Walkabout, Man of Photo, but it's putting an almost comedic a spin on it, and just in some ways simplifying it for the 80s, and probably to get it made, but it is an extraordinary film. It's not a bad old way to spend 90 minutes, 2 hours, and also seeing his development as well. And again, it's like someone who in some ways is rather chameleonic. He seems to have found what the 80s is about, what the pulse is, and yet all the old obsessions are still there.
Still present.
It sounds, as I say, I haven't seen it, but it sounds like the quintessential 80s movie, because it's kind of, it would have been set in the 50s, so there's the 50s obsession, 50s nostalgia. There's the Cold War bomb paranoia, and combined with sex comedy.
And also this thing about taking an actor who's known as one thing, and that became something that we see through Henry Fonda and Marlon Brando very famously, and then Tony Curtis does his version, where they sort of they know that they're at a certain point in their life, and it's like either you can sort of continue on for diminishing returns, or you can actually try and do some kind of vandalism on your own persona, your media persona. You spray paint graffiti over yourself almost. It's fascinating.
Not like what Karloff did with Bogdanovich in Targets, is it?
And I have to say, Curtis, who for me is just kind of someone who's there, but he's actually brilliant in this film. I've never seen him act quite like he does in this film, and the things he's willing to do as an actor, which someone of his standing, you'd think, God, I'm not doing that. I mean, he's really, whatever Rogue throws at him, he does it. Makes himself look very vulnerable. Even just on that level, it's a very interesting film, just to see how one actor, does a sort of sabotage of their own status.
Speaking of actors, is there any actor more fascinating than Donald Sutherland?
Oh my God!
I don't think there is.
God!
There are certain people who have they just have an aura, don't they? When they're in front of the camera, you can't help but look at them. Mads Mikkelsen has it, where they can't help it. It's not because of anything they do. It's because of who they are, just how they appear,
Yeah, it's not even about beauty. Like, I mean, Donald Sutherland is beautiful in this film. I mean, I've said before about Tom Hardy. I'm straight, but I fancy Tom Hardy. I would probably say I'd probably say the same thing about Donald Sutherland in the 70s. But it's not even about beauty. It's like that. Some people just have. There are just some people that nobody has ever looked or sounded quite like them.
It's even the way
Patrick Troughton is an example of this. Nobody other than Patrick Troughton ever looked or sounded like Patrick Troughton, and Donald Sutherland is just a complete original. He's just totally
the way they
unique.
dress him as well.
Yeah,
fucking coat. Yeah. It's just not just a coat. I mean, everything is really meticulous about the way they bring out the way he looks. And there's a very painterly quality to Rogue anyway in what he does. But I mean, he was very fascinated by the way people look. I mean, I know he rated Sutherland as an actor, as a very very good actor, which indeed he is. But it comes back to the same thing with when he wanted Jenny Agutter as in Walkabout, or when he wanted David Bowie in Man Fell to Earth. It was like, I know on paper Peter O'Toole is the better actor, but I want someone who really just looks like they have. And of course, the fascinating thing with Man Who Fell to Earth, as Bowie himself said, was I'm not an actor. I'm a singer. I'm a songwriter. But that fucking role won't leave me alone. I left with the clothes, and I left unable to leave Thomas Newton behind. He's the covers of my next two albums are from that film. They didn't need to be. Right. And of course, the last thing he does in his life is a play about Thomas Newton. He can never lose the character, and there's another thing entirely. But yes, absolutely, Donald Sutherland looks amazing. Sounds amazing.
There is a magnetism,
does something crazy, but there's an unpredictable quality to what I like about Sutherland is he does something which could so easily go wrong, which is I've found as I've sort of got older, and I guess I do look at actors in a slightly more analytical way because the job I was trained for. I'm got a real problem. I'm more drawn to what I would call impressionistic actors rather than expressionistic actors to borrow from fine art. I don't. Apart from the fact that he's I've just looked on the shelf, but apart from the fact that he's extremely that word again problematic as an individual, but I
is he? I didn't know that.
Not Sutherland. The next person I'm going to mention.
Right.
Klaus Kinski.
Oh God!
Yeah. Problematic is very polite. That's very polite.
Yeah, Kinski's kind of fascinating to watch, but frankly, it's so expressionistic. I get rather bored because Kinski doesn't give me enough. He's telling me what I want rather than whereas Sutherland could so easily be an expressionistic actor because he does have some rather unpredictable and unusual and unconventional gestures and but he is actually
those eyes
but
of course the temptation when you look like Klaus Kinski to take on that style of acting
exactly, whereas Sutherland he's got these things which could so easily tip that way. I really admire his super control, and yet at the same time he's never boring. I mean that to me that is the encapsulation of the perfect actor to my taste. Someone who has got these oddities to them that just make them a little bit more interesting to watch, but they're not fucking overdoing it with me. There's an enormous quality control in what he does in that film.
And it's very important, of course, in this because those two have to be real for it to work.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it is just not. It is going to fall apart.
Yeah, and there's something, and it's not even so much in the context of the story, although that's enough. Although she's a very attractive woman, she manages to elicit such a kind of it's very difficult. She just looks, even when she smiles, she looks so pained all the time, and you can't help but root for again. So it's these choices of Nick Rogues. They're obviously he was not willing to compromise on having these two actors.
Clearly,
but you can kind of see why he went for them, because they do have interesting qualities beyond their acting, which I think is the point you were originally trying to make. Yeah,
and it is one of those things where it's just impossible to imagine the text without them. It just wouldn't.
I mean, I'm sure I remember reading somewhere not too long ago that someone was thinking of remaking this film, and
well, I know Mark Kermode claps himself on the back, and why not? He's strongly of the belief that he got it stopped. Because got such a fuss about it being made, that they just sort of backed out. Which I think, that's ego, but fair play. If you think it's you, fine. But I know what you mean, because I tried to listen to and they're perfectly good actors. I've seen them on the stage and other things, but I tried to listen to the radio version from about 20 years ago with Anna Chancellor and Michael Feast, both very good actors. You just can't do it. It's once Christie and Sutherland, they've stamped on it so hard. Once they're in your head, it's really hard to get them out. And the fact, the fact that they've used this Canadian actor as well for John, there's nothing to say in the script, but it just adds an extra layer of the liminal into the whole thing, because he's Canadian, he's not American, he's Canadian, he's not British, and it's just that. And because Sutherland did so much British television before he took off as an actor, he occupies such an odd place.
It is a strange place, isn't it? And he still occupies that very strange space where he does lots of very small projects, lots of very high-profile projects at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I always think when he turns up in Oliver Stone's JFK, it's like the film is wild, and then he comes along and it's like, oh, I'm starting to believe everything now. He has that quality. He has that quality, which is incredible. It's that real grounding truth that he manages to exude.
He's
pretty phenomenal.
He's in another of my all-time favorite movies, which is the 70s remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
I was just about to mention, yes.
Oh, wow.
Stunning.
Another of the absolutely essential, quintessential movies of the 1970s.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, it basically just is the 1970s, in cinema form,
right?
isn't it?
Yeah.
I watched that. That was the first film I watched when we went into the first lockdown. I had such a great time with that film.
That's so weird, because I watched that in lockdown as well.
There's something about certain films that just lend themselves to that odd state. But everyone in that film, I mean, the extraordinary performances of everyone. I mean, Crumbs, very famous. Jeff Goldblum. But also, I think,
Nimoy.
Who actually gives a tremendous performance.
Really good in that.
Really good. I mean, and you just think, if only you had that opportunity to be more like this and to show these other facets to you.
I think Nimoy was a really good actor, actually. And he was one of those actors who could, he was in an awful lot of crap, let's be honest. I mean, much of Star Trek being in that category. As much as I personally have affection for it, a lot of it is just shit. But Nimoy, again, like Troughton, he's one of those actors that can be in stuff like that, and he can raise it by just being in it, and
just by his presence, right?
Yeah, with presence and dignity.
It's
and
because he treats it with gravitas, doesn't he? That's what it is. He takes patently absurd situations and material and just treats it very, very seriously.
But what I love about his performance in Invasion of the Body Snatchers is he treats it very seriously with a lightness that he seldom had a chance to show. There's a sort of like a glee, a joie de vivre in the way he plays that role. And then, of course, there's the sucker punch.
That bit where he sort of pretends to attack Jeff Goldblum and then turns around on Brooke Adams and says, "How do you feel about that?"
It's like, where are we going?
He's absolutely skewering that West Coast, therapist culture as well.
Right.
I always thought that was one of those. Again, another person who nobody ever looked like that except this one person.
Right.
And this time I'm talking about. Well, I'm talking about Nimoy, but I'm also talking about an historical personage, Abraham Lincoln. Right. Now I've seen various people play Abraham Lincoln. Sam Waterston did it. did a decent enough job. Daniel Day-Lewis did a decent enough job, but nobody looks like Abraham Lincoln.
No.
Leonard Nimoy kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln.
He does, yeah.
I wish
does.
that TV version of the Gore Vidal novel, the rather good Gore Vidal novel about Lincoln that they did with Sam Waterston, I kind of wish they'd cast Nimoy, because the trouble is that, you know, at that point it was just like, Nimoy's a punchline because it was just Mr. Spock. Yeah.
Sadly, I think the last thing he was in was one of the Transformers films.
Well,
who Leonard Nimoy?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Still, Anthony Hopkins has done one. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And
John Turturro's in them.
What I absolutely adore about Anthony Hopkins is that he is unabashed about the fact that he's just shilling now. He's completely unabashed about it, and I love that. He talks about
the guy.
He just wants to paint his silly pictures. And,
he's 80-something. He's had a symphony put on. He's been in some great films. He's got a rep.
I am one of the rare people who actually likes the film of Hannibal. Actually rates it quite highly. Certainly better than the damn book.
I remember just being incredibly. I mean, one of the things I actually liked about Hannibal, I've only seen it the once, and it was around the time it came out. But my worry about it was that it's going to be like The Silence of the Lambs. But one of the glorious things about it was how damn operatic it was. How unashamedly operatic.
I've got to be honest with you. If somebody said you can watch one of the Hannibal Lecter movies, I would watch Hannibal.
Yeah. Totally.
I'd enjoy that more than Silence of the Lambs, to be honest, which I think is an overrated film.
It hasn't aged
the TV series is it for me.
It's the apex, right? I just finished rewatching that for the umpteenth billionth time.
I'm gearing up for it.
So much.
I'm gearing up for it.
Oh God, every single time.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, isn't it? It's fucking ridiculous. I watch it. I've watched it so many times, and I can't believe it exists.
Well,
no, me neither.
It's not even 3 seasons. It's 3 separate shows that just somehow have a connection. Because everything about those 3 seasons is such on a different track.
And the 3rd season is kind of broken into 2.
Yes,
so
it's very strange.
It's like 4 shows actually, where the 3rd and the 4th are kind of mini ones.
Yeah,
because I really thought when we were gearing up for the Tooth Fairy, I was like, but I've seen this in Manhunter. Oh gosh, and oh my God, it was so well done.
And well done. It works so damn well, doesn't it? The way they tie the Red Dragon into the mythology that Will and Hannibal are spinning between themselves.
Yeah.
Richard Armitage just needed this job to like. My God, you are a good actor. I mean, I always thought he was kind of solid. But again, one of those actors is just there. And it's like, oh God, you're good. You've just needed this. And I love it when that happens, because sometimes I really, an actor gets cast in something and it's either out of their casting or it's just not something that they normally get. And you really gun for them. And 95% of the time they fuck it up. And there's a reason they didn't get that they shouldn't have been allowed near that part. He's one of the 5% in that, because like, oh yeah, you this is the one, you've got this. Very good.
Well, anyway, guys.
I think, yes, considering that we've span off into Hannibal now, which is, I mean, it is something we're going to have to do, I think.
Our listeners
I'd love to, yeah. The only other thing I wanted to say about the Don't Look Now is that I did get serious The Omen vibes at times. Probably just because it's so 70s, but the scene in the church where Donald Sutherland nearly gets killed by, a falling piece of wood. That is so brilliantly edited, by the way. The way it cuts between the falling.
He was getting his Warner moment at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. If it was a different sort of film, we would have had a fake Sutherland head rolling across the screen. But
wonderful.
Similar themes at work in some respects, although The Omen is very much the Dayglow.
The hackneyed. Still wonderful, but the sort of the full on Penny Dreadful.
Absolutely. Whereas it's slightly more subtle.
Fascinating what was in the air at that point, and I think that's one of the great things about coming to films from any decade, but this one's in a very the 70s just is interesting.
Yeah, right. I mean, you talked about Invasion of the Body Snatchers earlier. I mean, that is like it's crystallized, condensed 70s paranoia, isn't it? It's everything informing culture just expressed on screen.
Yeah, but it takes it right, it takes it out of the realm of, politics in the conventional sense, and it takes it right into biopolitics and psychopolitics.
It's something else.
Paranoia as, it's paranoia about the existence of other people in itself, as bodies and as minds around you. It's
brilliant. It is an amazing. We're gonna have to do
that. I could watch this again.
Yeah, we'll have to do that, I think.
Fantastic. And yes, I must tell Kit that I've caught up with Get Out. I know he's a huge.
Get Out's great. Yeah. Do you know what I watched? I rewatched the other day. I was just sort of letting YouTube do its thing, letting the algorithm do its thing, and it came on the Stepford Wives.
Oh wow!
Which in many respects, Get Out is kind of a modern remake, of course, with the themes, relocated to a different political locus. But that is terrible. That is a terrible, awful film. But it's kind of interesting.
But it was a point. I actually put it on Twitter because I had missed Get Out when it originally, did. But I mean, I know it's not very old, but the temper's feuded. Time moves on, and suddenly you realise there's a bunch of films you haven't seen, so I end up catching up with things. And the horror of the moment with everything going on, and I turned to my partner and said, his only means of survival is to pick cotton out of a chair.
Yeah.
And that blew my fucking mind.
Right.
And I was like, Jordan Peele, you are absolutely uncompromising.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, what a thing to put in a film with that narrative as well.
I love subtlety. But there is a time where you just want,
There's a time for the kick between the eyes. Yeah.
Right.
And that is, there's nothing subtle about it, but my God, I went bolt up in my chair. It was just like, I can't believe that. Oh my God, he is. Oh my God, that's his plot device. Yeah. Oh Jesus! And I was like, that thing you were talking about, George, like pacing up and down.
Yeah.
Have either of you seen a film from round about the same time as Get Out? I think it was slightly after, called The Boy.
The Boy. No, I don't think I've seen that one.
That's not the one. No, I'm thinking of something else.
If you watch the trailer, you would think it's an Annabelle knockoff. You would think it's a bog standard spooky doll horror movie. Right? It's actually, in my opinion anyway, it's actually really, really good. Like, I think it's kind of like Get Out, but on the subject of like abusive, immature masculinity and sexism and controlling relationships and stuff like that. It's, in many respects, I won't spoil it, but in many respects, it's a film that I would like what it does. I would normally be very strongly against what it does texturally. But it does. I think it's a really good. I think there are bits of it that are genuinely kind of spooky and creepy. There are clumsy and ham-fisted things about it. It's not a brilliant film, but I think there are interesting things about it. And I also think it's quite. It is, as I say, it's kind of a bit like Get Out in terms of its political addresses. It's worth seeing. I think The Boy.
Right.
I will put that on my list.
Definitely.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Always on
it's a film that kind of sunk, without making much impact, and I think that's a little bit unfair.
I can't bring it to mind at all, which is unusual because most like horror-based films, I will at least have a kind of peripheral awareness of.
I think it did too good a job, kind of marketing itself as just another one of those films. Because there's 17 billion horror movies every year, and
of
the vast majority of them are completely disposable.
Total dross. Yeah.
Yeah. The Insidious 12 and Ouija 2, etc., and
the next remake of A Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween and whatnot.
As I say, it's a bit more interesting than that, I think obviously the studio said no, market it to the the usual crowd and try to make it look as much like a bog standard movie as you possibly can. Make the audience think they're just going to get the standard jump scares, etc.
So it's the Fight Club phenomena, right? Where the trailer has next to nothing to do with the actual film.
Yeah, well, the trailer's kind of. the trailer kind of gives away too. I mean, I would say
which they often do.
They often do, but the trailer makes it look like something it's not, and it does the film a disservice. I would say the film is actually a bit more interesting than the trailer makes it look, and I think the film kind of sunk without anybody quite noticing that it was actually a minor gem, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Oh, wicked. Oh, cool. Yeah,
I'll have a look for that.
Thank you.
Definitely have a look for that one.
Sweet. Well, it's been a joy again, and
well, guys,
I don't know what we're going to recommence with.
I think we've mooted quite a few this time around, haven't we? I mean, the Wicker Man we've got to do, I suppose, at some point. If we're going to do Midsummer, we've got to do the Wicker Man. You're kind of contractually obliged.
Right? That was fantastic to watch. That was so good.
Yeah,
that's such a great film.
And again, I mean, that talking about lead performance, Florence Pugh.
Yeah, right.
God, I mean, talk about you know being presented as just the teenage heroine, and then doing so much more.
Mm-hmm.
What a phenomenal performance.
Kind of upset to see her already being siphoned off into fucking Marvel, but you can't blame anybody for taking the money, can you?
No,
well,
you really can't.
Agents are very difficult to even on the very minor scale, like myself. I still have I had a they are very peculiar things, agents. And I remember the one that still sticks in my craw, and of course it's very minor compared to these actors who are doing MCU or like great films, but I was going to be at Oxford, and it was a piece of new writing, but it was to play Siegfried Sassoon. And when I looked I actually quite like him, and I got the part. And I was so excited. And my agent advised me not to do it. She said, "Oh, it's not. No, I don't want you off at the Oxford Playhouse doing that when we could have you in London doing this." Well, the thing in London doing this never happened. And and it was an early lesson in, for heaven's sake, do what you want to much as you can, because I really, really regret not doing that play. It was such a good piece of writing, and playing that guy, right, fascinating. But hey ho. But MCU never called.
It's early days, you'll get the call.
It's early days. Yeah.
Is there any particular MCU character that you have a hankering to play?
To be quite honest, I mean, this is just going to make me sound like a Scorsese guy or something, but I actually gave up on them. I mean, it was a friend of mine, a lovely guy, a really good friend. He basically updated, and it's not from a snobbish point of view. I hope he updated it, and for some reason, it was just one of those things that passed me by. It's not that I've never seen any superhero movies. I've seen my share of superheroes. I saw the X-Men films. I saw the Batman films. But for some reason, MCU just happened so fast. It seemed to me, and the schedule seemed so relentless. I just once I knew I was falling behind, I just thought, well, sod it. Well, anyway, he updated his collection to Blu-ray or something, and he very kindly gave me them, and I started with Captain America, and I didn't enjoy it, and then it was like it was over a month before I then watched the second one. Then it was like 2 months before I watched the third one, and the third one was Iron Man, and then I wanted to kill myself.
Oh, that's the living end, isn't it?
And then I think Kit said to me, jump ahead to the Avengers. At least that's like kind of fun. And I thought, okay, that's okay. But it
is kind of fun. As much as it pains me to say it, the first Avengers.
But
movie
everything
is kind of fun.
It's that it is not that it just everything is inured in a kind, or marinated, as I like to say, in just a kind of form that doesn't work for me. And it is this, it's the two S's. Well, the three S's: sentiment, sassiness, and spectacle. The writer's voice is so loud. I'm just like, I can't be doing with any of this. And everyone, and I think it was a point that you might have made, Jack, actually, and I think there's a real crossover in our taste regarding this point is I don't like watching, and I know I went and watched Get Out, but it's a different context, but I don't like watching films where people are relentlessly bullied. And Captain America was about this guy just being relentlessly bullied. Even when he became Captain America, he was relentlessly bullied, but in a different way. And I thought,
it's horrible.
This is tiring, because this isn't a film like Get Out. This is meant to be a piece of escapism, a piece of spectacle, a piece of, and I'm just feeling like shit watching this film with this guy who's like
I agree, it's horrible. It is
badly, so I ended up never completing, but they did go to a good home, because my young nephew is absolutely at the right age for that kind of thing, and he was thrilled to have them all. And but I think the only time I ever sort of half enjoyed it was the first reel of Hulk. But only because I just thought the setting was interesting. I mean, very expensive, but just
I like that. I like the Edward Norton Hulk movie. I know it's shit, but I kind of like it because Hulk is my favorite superhero by a fucking mile.
It had a gentler pace, and it did well. By a gentler pace, I mean it wasn't hyperkinetic for ages. It wasn't until the back end where you kind of expect it. And
the end is boring.
They weren't doing all the sass, but largely because it's not programmed into Hulk to do that. He's monosyllabic, and boy, is that a wonderful thing, because breaking up from terrible things to look into camera and then crack a quip. I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake, just. And it is fucking Joss Whedon doing a lot of it, isn't it? And unless said that. I'm kind of hoping, in a way, that not only do the people who've suffered at the hands of Joss Whedon get some kind of compensation for it, but if it could also help put a sort of like a complete dampener on his influence on popular culture, would be great, because too many people have picked up that baton. The Joss Whedon. We could do with this. Everyone being shamed into kind of stopping with that now. He's one of those people who's been so even if you like the original thing, the influence, the omnipresent influence is just intolerable. Absolutely smothering. But anyway,
one film I would love to talk about with you guys from a position of hatred, pure absolute hatred, is The Cabin in the Woods.
The Cabin.
Despise, loathe, and detest that film. So if you ever want to do an episode that's just me seething and griping, etc.,
I think all you'll hear is me chewing popcorn while you go for
it. I would like to do that and goad you on, sort of poke you with a stick and watch you go, because I think that would be very cool.
It's just this insufferable air of kind of nose tapping,
kind of winking at the camera. What are we doing? Look what we've done. Don't you? Clever audience. I'm
so much cleverer than this genre that I'm taking the piss out of. You actually like this crap, don't you? But I know how I'm so much cleverer than this, and I'm going to. And
geek fear. These guys are all geeks like us, and they're afraid. And this is where this device comes from. I'm convinced. It's like because
it's the same with Stephen Moffat. Stephen Moffat was deadly kind of neurotic about the geek label. But the thing about Cabin in the Woods is that the whole thing is predicated on this kind of ironic, superior disdain for the genre that he's parodying or satirizing or whatever it is he thinks he's doing. And it's clear from that film that this guy doesn't know the first fucking thing about that genre.
No, he only knows the images. He knows the surface, and that's it.
It's not just that he doesn't have any actual sort of political or critical analysis of it. He doesn't even understand how it works on a plot level.
Right.
He's taking
you've got to be really kind of good on this as well, because I think as a starting point, if you're a writer who comes into a genre and you're taking the piss out of it and the audience that you've got of that genre's audience, you're already on a sticky wicket. You kind of get that actually with a little bit with Douglas Adams when he was doing Doctor Who. Is that he's just better at it. But it's like you've come into something and you're taking the piss out of it, but the people watching it like it.
There's
how long's this going to work for?
With regards to horror, you've got Joss Whedon on one hand you've got Cabin in the Woods, and then you've got Matthew Holness doing Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. Now, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place is kind of it's similar in terms of it's trying to satirize horror fiction, but it does it so much better because it knows
Sam Raimi trying to do. Who just does both, depending on the film.
Yeah,
the two bits of Garth Marenghi, like the piss take of the James Herbert, Sean Hudson, Richard Lehman kind of horror writer on the one hand, and the cheesy television show on the other, they don't really quite fit together. But the in and of themselves, discreetly, they are perfect.
They're absolutely brilliant, aren't they?
I just got to superb. See this again, because I've not seen it since.
You accept the sticking together of them. You accept it as a conceit.
Yeah.
Somehow it works. It shouldn't, but it does work.
Was David Hoyle in it?
I think so.
Or am I confused? It might have been another one of those, of that ilk that was out
sadly,
at the same time.
Graham fucking Linehan is in it a couple of times. Sadly,
before
who is now gone. Total Holocaust denial,
completely
which I guess was inevitable.
Yeah, what a surprise, right?
There is something about. I mean, I'm always very suspicious of slippery slope arguments, but there is just something about this.
I know what you mean. And yet this is playing out exactly that way, isn't it?
Yeah. It is, isn't it?
Yeah. What the hell?
I mean, it happens. These people, once they get started, and transphobia is such a trap to get them started, there just seems to be this fucking.
They just
almost,
keep going, don't they?
Yeah. 45 degree, inclined plane that somebody has smothered in fucking chip fat. It's just the minute you step onto the top bit of it with a little bit of transphobia, you just down you go.
It's the sheer amount of them, though, that are revealed as being problematic in many other ways, like they're abusers, they're stalkers, it's unbelievable. They're covert racists, they're misogynists. It's amazing how often that happens.
Yeah. But then again, curious to know who, if anyone, has been sort of advising or assisting Linehan, because I think I might have said this.
Probably no one.
I think I might have said this before. A man who, God, I am nobody, but a man who tried to ruin my reputation in a blog, and then changed it when it looked a little bit, like. There could be repercussions. Has obviously never heard of Time Machine because I've got the original.
Right.
I've never done anything with it. I'm quite happy to put that to bed because I am nobody and I prefer to stay nobody. But it's like, mate, come on, that's basic. I mean, I'm 19th century when it comes to computers, and even I found the original.
That's like deleting a tweet and expecting it to go away.
Exactly. Would you give your eye teeth to be able to talk to his wife? His ex-wife. I would give my eye teeth to be able to talk to her, because I guarantee there's more going on there. Nobody. It's like homophobes. It doesn't surprise me at all when you hear stories of homophobes being sexually problematic. It really doesn't, because nobody can be that obsessed with other people's private lives and not have some terrible neurosis going on.
I'm sure if the ex Mrs. Glinner got started, it would be like Alex Jones's ex-wife.
Yeah, sure. Right.
But this is often the thing when just looking around to it and everything. It's I'm also have to factor in my own just innate laziness. But I just look at some of these people, whether it is Alex Jones or or Graham Linehan, whoever it may be. How have you got the time?
Yeah.
Where does the time come from?
Yeah.
And
the energy, the space in their heads that you take up. It's like. What?
I mean, I've got fan genes about certain things, but even I can go several days, if not weeks, without thinking.
Well, it's the old saw, isn't it? Nobody thinks about homosexual sex more than homophobes, right?
Yeah.
Nobody. And that includes us. That includes me and my lot, right?
Yeah.
We are shocked at the amount that they think they know and that they talk about it, right? And almost everything they presume to know seems to come from gay pornography, which is really strange.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
What you want to do is if you get people into a rant, then their autocorrect starts kicking in, and it's like their most used words, and then you can tell an awful lot about someone.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
All right, I know where you've been.
My all-time favorite example of that was the Louise Mensch thing, where she said she put the screenshot of the Twitter search, and look what happens when you search for Jeremy Corbyn, and said, that's your fucking search history, Louise.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, dear, man.
It is incredible. I mean, I don't talk to them anymore. I don't argue with homophobes anymore. I just tell them to go fuck themselves. But when I did, I was always amazed at the degree of their interest, their obsessive fascination with the distortions they've created in their own heads. That amazed me every single time.
Yeah,
the stuff they think they know,
isn't it?
The stuff they think they know, and they are totally ignorant.
Yeah, I'm not the man's biggest fan anymore, but there is a section in Stephen Fry's autobiography, the first volume, where he talks about this, where he talks about sort of watching debates about lowering the age of consent for gay men on in the House of Lords and stuff like that, and recounting the attitude, not just what they say, but the tone and the facial expressions, etc. of these old bastards, on the red benches. So, do you know what these people actually do to each other?
Yeah.
I haven't given
Incidentally,
it. Incidentally,
I absolutely loved. I loved the comment. I was telling my other half about it. The comment you put up, Jack, in a thread recently. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think what it was pertaining to. I can't. It was so good, but I've now divorced it.
Wasn't the Joe Rogan thread, was it?
It was probably.
Yes.
Just talking about the sort of right-wing guy in his 20s and 30s who I think you described as an eternally frozen teenage mindset. I think it was, wanting to understand but not wanting to learn. Wanting to transgress but wanting to. But being obsessed about other people's morality. I thought that was almost the perfect tweet. I thought that one's worth framing. That was beautifully done. It's like, oh my God, there it is in 140 words or whatever. That's it exactly.
Yeah, that is pretty much it. I was listening
to a certain podcast, which I won't name, where they were covering Joe Rogan, from an oppositional perspective. But these guys, they're liberal centrists and sort of science bros, etc. They're the sort of people who will criticize Joe Rogan for being anti-vax, but they will kind of do it in a way that makes it, he's unpopular with the left because he doesn't go in for woke dogma. That's an actual quote. Right. That's an actual quote from the podcast I was listening to, and I was thinking, somebody needs to put this better than these guys. So
it sort of comes back to George's point about it's the same issue. It's the phantasms in people's heads. Things that don't actually exist.
Yeah, right.
I mean, oh my God, it is. But they're reified. It's like, what? Yeah, incredible. Absolutely.
It comes back to what you were talking about, though, Elliot, where they become subsumed into the identity of the individual. They're the brain worms that kind of become part of the synapses, right? They burrow in and become part of who you are, and suddenly you can't get away from them. I mean, that's Glinner, isn't it? That's what he's become. There's nothing else in his life, is there? That's how he's got all the time and energy. There is nothing else in his life.
They're so desperate to be oppressed. They're so desperate to be persecuted, and they make it happen. Not really, but they make enough people angry at them that they can get, they go on Twitter and they say stuff, and they write an article or whatever, and they, because of course now we have social media, so people can you hear back from the audience in a way that you didn't when these people were getting started in their careers. So they go on Twitter after writing some ridiculous, disgusting thing about whatever, and they get criticized. So they've created in their own heads anyway, the persecution that they desperately want. Because when you can fool yourself into thinking that you're being persecuted and silenced and victimized, it instantly confers, a feeling of virtue onto you, which is exactly what they accuse the left of doing, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because it's all projection all the way down.
The levels of
What's
projection.
the old thing about
gaslighting?
Whatever they
incredible.
accuse you of doing, they are doing constantly.
It's like, it's the classic. It's cancel culture.
That's the transference, isn't it?
Yeah, cancel culture. The only people cancelling books are the right.
Well, that's what the next Daniel and I are recording our next.
Oh, you're doing Mouse, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Brilliant.
We're recording our next mainline IDSG tomorrow night, and we're going to be talking about the banning of Mouse, and we're going to get on to James fucking Lindsay and Christopher Rufo and Moms for Liberty and all this stuff.
I don't know how you do, Lindsay. I really don't. I cannot argue with him because all I want to do is swear at him.
It's pure hate.
I just want to call him what he is, which is a fucking rat-faced rodent, just a parasite. There is nothing. He's not even like other like Joe Rogan. I hate Joe Rogan to bits, but he is just stupid, isn't he? I get the impression that he is actually sincere a lot of the time. He's just not very clever.
I don't think Joe Rogan is lying about anything. I think Joe Rogan is just a fickle, scattershot-minded, semi-educated, rich guy idiot who has stumbled into this massive influence platform.
Absolutely.
James Lindsay is a malignant, narcissistic, vicious, nasty little man. He is, and he's going pretty much all the way. He is pretty much all the way there. Like, we're saying Glinner's getting up to Holocaust denial. James Lindsay's pretty much there.
He's pretty much got there already, hasn't he?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah. As Daniel and I were talking about this sort of off camera, so to speak, the other night, and I was saying, James Lindsay's project is clear. James Lindsay is going to read the first paragraph of the Wikipedia entry for every left-wing Jewish thinker of the 20th century. He's already done. Well, I mean, Hegel's not 20th century Jewish, but he's a key figure on the left. But he's already done Marcuse. Next it's going to be Fromm and Adorno and Horkheimer and Walter Benjamin, and he's going to go through the Wikipedia entries for all of these guys, and he's going to tweet basically the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. That's what he's doing. He's just repeating the Bolshevismus conspiracy theory, the Nazi conspiracy theory,
and that's going to say,
and he's being funded to do it
that
by
latent anti-Semitism just beautifully, doesn't it?
Yeah. And he's being funded in it by a fucking fundamental, crackpot conspiracy theory fundamentalist Christian. What's the guy's name? Michael Fallon. Michael something like that. Michael Fallon's the actor, isn't he? Something. Like that. And he's that's his career now. He's gone way beyond pranks on academics. He's full on fucking.
But that absolutely will appeal to that. As I say, that wonderfully pithy statement about people who the mindset of wanting to understand but not wanting to learn. I mean, that's what it is.
It's that teenage thing where you think political understanding consists of they've got of course they've had UFOs for ages. They've got them hidden away in secret hangars, and JFK says he's going to pull out of Vietnam and then he gets killed by a lone gunman. When you're 17, that feels really fucking clever,
almost excusable as well when you're 17. But for heaven's sake,
it's that same thing. It's that know it all, can't fool me, I get it, you don't, sheeple thing. In a different register. Joss Whedon is doing the same thing with culture. He's saying, I know better about slasher movies than you, without actually knowing a fucking thing about the text.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's aggressive.
The same thing as banding around the word symbolism, but not saying what things are symbolic of. It's all part of the same matrix.
It is. It's what all of these flapping heads do. They justify people in their ignorance. The people who listen to them feel smart. They feel fulfilled by them.
That is fundamentally what they're all selling, from Rogan to Lindsay. They are all selling people a commodity that they will pay. They will pay hand over foot to consume this commodity, and the commodity is validation of their ignorant intuition.